Hello, fellow kids, and maybe a few adults, and welcome back to What is Politics? It's good to be back. For those of you who've been wondering where I've been for the last year or so, I've basically just been working nonstop on this secret history of the Israel-Palestine conflict series the entire time. What was originally intended to be a single episode turned into a 6-part series, and 4 of them will be coming out in the next month or two. If you're watching this show for the first time, the point of this show is to look at politics in ways that help make us into more empowered and efficient political actors who are more able to achieve our own goals in politics and in life. Much of what we learn when it comes to politics, from the media and from school, from our friends, from academia, is a bunch of confused gorble, produced in ways that prod you to form an opinion on various subjects and events without understanding how anything works or what you can do about anything. In big hierarchical societies like ours, politics is supposed to be a spectator sport, and actually doing things is supposed to be the job of the experts and the think tankers and politicians and the rich people who buy and trade those politicians like baseball cards. So I'm trying to teach politics in a way that is oriented around action. In this particular series, we'll be focused on solving the Israel-Palestine conflict. And obviously we're not going to solve it with a bunch of videos, but if this conflict is ever going to be solved in any way besides massive ethnic cleansing or genocide of one side or the other, it's going to have to be solved by the actual people involved in it. Otherwise, it'll be left to their politicians and their state patrons, i.e. the same class of people who created this conflict in the first place and who perpetuate it without end. And if people are going to act intelligently and in their own interests, then they need to act on the complete information. And complete information is something that has been sorely lacking in this conflict, on both sides. Historians on both sides have been hiding information from their people, and very often it's the same information that's being hidden on both sides. It's my belief, given the desires and aspirations of people on both sides of this conflict, which I know from talking to people and from polling that's been done in the region for many years, it's my belief that this conflict can be solved without the atrocious violence that we've been seeing not only from October 7th on, but for decades and decades. But this can only happen if people have some of this missing information. Whether they want to hear this information or what they do with it is another story, but we have to start somewhere. And maybe that starts with you, reaching out to the people you know who are involved in this. In most conflicts or disputes, you have one party hiding a bunch of inconvenient facts that make them look bad, and then they expose and propagate a bunch of convenient facts that make the other party look bad and that justifies their own position and goals. Meanwhile, the other party is hiding a bunch of different facts that make them look bad while promoting those facts that make the other side look bad and that support their aims. Sisters like, "Mommy, brother punched me, wah!" And then brothers like, "Mommy, sister stole my dinosaur, wah!" And then sisters like, "I took his dinosaur because he knocked over my Barbie house." And then you sort of put all the pieces together to figure out the whole story and figure out who's responsible for what. Each side is acting like the victim. Each side did something bad, but brother started it by knocking over the Barbies because he was annoyed that they were in his way or something stupid. And you can figure this out by putting together both brother and sister stories that they're telling you. But sometimes both parties will hide the same facts because it challenges the legitimacy of both their claims and their agendas. Like, imagine 2 people fighting about money that one guy owes the other guy. And one guy says, "Bert signed a contract, and I fulfilled the contract, and I delivered the merchandise, but he won't pay me." And then Bert is saying, "No way, Ernie's lying. He delivered a bunch of garbage, not the quality merchandise that we agreed on. That's why he didn't pay." And they're each making their arguments, but they're both hiding something really important. Neither side mentions that the contract that they're fighting about is a contract to sell sex slaves to Jeffrey Epstein's island. Suddenly, with that one bit of information, the whole moral context of the story changes completely, so that it doesn't matter anymore who's telling the truth and who's screwing who. They're both pieces of shit who should be in jail in the first place. You can find a discussion on a historical example of this in the book Silencing the Past by historian Michel-Rolph Trouillot, where he discusses how historians wrote about the Haitian Revolution. The anti-colonial historians would paint the revolution as a war between the evil French colonists and the heroic Haitian rebels fighting for their freedom, which the heroic rebels eventually won. And the pro-French historians would paint the revolution as a power grab by a clique of sadistic, self-interested, aspiring despots, the founding fathers of Haiti. And the pro-French historians would emphasize their bloody dictatorial practices before and after they seized power. And the pro-French version was basically saying that French rule was becoming more liberal and benevolent, and they were going to abolish slavery, and the Haitians would have been much better off if these savage, bloodthirsty, dictatorial rebel leaders hadn't seized power and turned the island into a tyrannical hellhole. Trouillot points out that historians on both sides painted this battle as a battle between two sides, the French and the future founders of Haiti. And they conveniently ignored the fact that there was actually a third side in the Revolutionary War, a rebel army of African-born slaves led by Jean-Baptiste Sans Souci, who had originally fought with the Founding Fathers, but then he and his forces split off from them during the war when the Founding Fathers betrayed the rebel cause and opportunistically joined up with the French in the middle of the Revolution. And the revolutionary traitors, these Founding Fathers, they only switched back to the rebel side when the French incorrectly started to believe that the Creole officers, the Founding Fathers, were secretly collaborating with the genuine revolutionary Sans Souci, whose rebellion continued unabated. Henri Christophe, the first king of Haiti, eventually had Sans Souci assassinated after the revolution, and he named his royal palace after him as a symbol of victory over his principal rival, the leader of the true freedom fighters and revolutionaries. So historians on both sides would write the history of the revolution while routinely erasing or glossing over this crucial and fascinating part of the history. Sans Souci's rebellion doesn't really appear in these histories. The anti-colonialists left it out because they wanted to portray the Founding Fathers of Haiti as the good guys, and leaving that story in would expose them as self-interested traitors. And the pro-French historians would ignore the story of Sans Souci because it showed that the revolution was not just a power grab by some opportunistic despots and their henchmen, but rather it was a true grassroots revolution, a movement for liberation, which the French and the Founding Fathers of Haiti together saw as their primary enemy. And by hiding that story, historians also left out a whole ethnic and class conflict dynamic of the story, where the Creole officers, the Founding Fathers, were wealthier Creole-born people versus the largely poorer African-born rebels under Sans Souci. So when you uncover that secret history, the two competing historical narratives arguing about who are the good guys and who are the bad guys becomes a new story where both sides were the bad guys, and the real good guys and the ultimate victims of the story who suffered under both sets of bad guys was the Haitian population. Sans Souci wasn't totally erased from history, and neither were the battles between him and the Creole officers. But when historians would write about them, they were just sort of diluted or glossed over in a way that made the fighting between Sans Souci and the Creole officers look like random fighting that happens between different rebel factions for some incomprehensible reason that isn't that important. The class story and the treachery disappear from the popular understandings of history on both sides. Now, there's a very similar dynamic when it comes to historical writing and teaching about the origins of the Israel-Palestine conflict. You have two competing historical moral narratives which conspire together to leave out a whole set of crucial and fascinating events, which when exposed, fundamentally change the moral context of the story, and replace the competing claims about who the bad guys and good guys are with a new set of bad guys and good guys. Before we unravel a new narrative of the Israel-Palestine conflict, let's take a quick overview of the current narratives that are animating people's behavior today on both sides. According to the version of history that most Palestinians learn, there is no Israel-Palestine conflict. What there is, and always has been, is a colonial project to create and then expand a European Jewish state at the expense of the Arab population, which the Arab population is resisting and defending itself from, and always has been. From the get-go, the Zionists came to Palestine with the intent of creating a Jewish state there, and that project, by its very nature, required the dispossession and expulsion of huge numbers of the indigenous Arab population, which the Zionists eventually carried out in 1948, and which they've continued to carry out by various means since that time. And in that context, according to this narrative, violence against Israel and Israelis, and earlier violence against the Zionist population of Palestine before Israel existed, that violence is and was legitimate resistance to Israeli, Zionist, colonialist aggression and dispossession. And although sometimes this violence can go over the line and get ugly, what do you expect given the circumstances? And in this light, any violence by Israel or by the pre-Israel Zionists is and was aggression, working towards dispossession, or aggression aimed at maintaining and expanding the ill-gotten gains of Zionist colonialism. Meanwhile, the history that Israelis and supporters of Israel learn is that Zionists immigrated to Palestine peacefully, with the intention of creating a Jewish state there, not by dispossessing or expelling anyone, but by peacefully immigrating there and building institutions over many decades, until there were enough Jews concentrated in a geographic area that could form a state by democratic means. And there was no need to expel anyone to carry out this project. The aim was to create a state where Jews from around the world could immigrate to and escape persecution, but where the Arab minority and other minorities would enjoy full democratic political and civil rights, like minorities do today all over the industrialized world. And in this narrative, opposition to Zionism and violence against the Zionists, and later against Israel, had nothing to do with the Arabs engaging in self-defense or resistance against anything oppressive or wrong, because the Zionists weren't doing anything wrong to begin with. Rather, violence against the Zionists, then and against Israel today, was and is based primarily on intolerance and racism against Jews, an inability on behalf of the Arabs to accept that any part of the Arab Middle East could be anything but a Muslim, Arab-dominated territory, regardless of demographics. And if hundreds of thousands of Arabs were expelled from what became the Jewish state in 1948, this was only because Israel had to defend itself from a genocidal invasion of Arab armies who, according to their own open declarations, wanted to murder and expel all of the Jews. And also because the invading armies ordered the Palestinian Arabs to flee from their cities and villages in order to more effectively prosecute the war. The Arabs started a war, and then they lost it. And Israel can't be expected to just let them all return to a state after first trying to destroy that state. In this version of history, violence by Israel, including the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, which started in 1967 and continues till today, or the war that's been carried out in Gaza for more than a year as I write this, all of this is legitimate self-defense against Arab aggression, against 75 years of Palestinians not being able to accept that they lost a war that they unjustly started, and 75 years of them not willing to accept a fair, peaceful solution to this conflict, meaning various iterations of the two-state solution proposed and rejected again and again by the Arabs in 1937, 1947, and then again at Oslo in 2000, and some other agreements since then. And instead of agreeing to a fair two-state solution, the Arabs insist that the Israelis must be violently expelled from a land which they rightfully acquired through legal purchase, immigration, and victory in defensive wars. And the Arabs keep trying to destroy Israel, and they keep losing, and Israel keeps defending itself and winning, and then expanding its territory in order to protect itself from further attack. Sometimes it gets ugly, and Israel goes overboard, and lots of civilians die tragically, but ultimately it's the Arabs' fault in this narrative. And in this light, violence by Arabs is not resistance, but it's just simple terrorism, immoral attacks on civilians carried out with the aim of bullying Israelis into accepting their own eventual destruction, to get them to leave, and trying to wrangle up world opinion to help with the task by making Israel look like the bad guys, like South Africa in the 1980s. And the pinnacle of this story is the failure of the Oslo process, which was supposed to create a Palestinian state alongside Israel. And the pro-Israel camp says that, even though they'd been trying to kill us and expel us from the beginning, we still tried giving them their own state, which is what they themselves said that they wanted. But instead of accepting our offer or negotiating it, they used the negotiation process as cover to build up forces in order to attack us once again, because they don't want to live in peace side by side with us, they just want full Arab and Muslim domination. And when it comes to Oslo, the Palestinian side says that, even though the Israelis unjustly stole most of our land, and they expelled us from it for no reason besides ethnic cleansing to create a Jewish majority, we finally gave up on our claims, and we agreed to accept a small, degraded state on 22% of our former lands. But even then, the Israelis couldn't stick to that promise. They just used the negotiations as cover to keep stealing more and more of our land, and to intensify the occupation of our land and our people. And they clearly weren't going to give us a real state. They just wanted to set up a powerless puppet state that they could ultimately control, but that would look like a democratic, independent state to make the world shut up. So you have these two more or less coherent versions of history that create completely incompatible moral universes. In this series, we're going to examine the origins of the conflict, because that's where we can test the moral pillars of both of these versions of history. Someone on the Palestine side says, look at the horror story that Israel is perpetuating in Gaza. And then after, you have a huge fake news meme-based argument about how many casualties and horror situations each side believes are real or not real. The response from the pro-Israel side is, well, what's happening in Gaza is awful, but Israel is just doing self-defense to stop more October 7ths, because Hamas promised to do more and more October 7ths, so we have to remove them from power. And then the first person will point out that October 7th happened in the first place because Israel had been blockading and suffocating Gaza for 17 years before that. So what do you expect was going to happen after all that? And then the Israel person will say, well, we had to blockade Gaza to stop Hamas from importing materials to make rockets that they regularly fire into Israel. And then they'll point to the wave of Hamas suicide bombings in the 1990s on buses and cafes all over Israel, and how if the Palestinians would just lay down their arms, there would be peace and prosperity for everyone. But if Israel laid down her arms, Hamas would do genocide on Israel. And then the pro-Palestine guy will point to the dishonesty of Israel in the Oslo process. And the Israel guy will flip out, saying that it was the Palestinians who were dishonest in the Oslo process. And then they'll go back from there in time, and back from there, and they'll get to the occupation. And the Israel guy will say they had to do the occupation to stop all the attacks that the Palestinians were launching. And then the pro-Palestine guy will say, well, they launched all those attacks because Israel expelled them from their homes in 1948 and stole their land, and they just wanted to get their land back. And the Israel guy will say, well, they only expelled the Palestinians because the Arabs were trying to genocide them. And what they're ultimately getting at is whether the conflict is fundamentally about Arab intolerance of Jews or about Jewish dispossession of Arabs. And we can answer that question by looking at all the violent clashes that happened since the first Zionists moved to Palestine starting in the 1880s. Before the War of 1948 that resulted in the creation of the State of Israel and the displacement of 700,000 or so Palestinians, there had already been 70 years of violent clashes between Arabs and Jews in Palestine, particularly between the Arab peasants, who were the vast majority of the population, and Jews living in agricultural settlements. And for the most part, these were attacks by the Arabs, by the peasants, on the Jewish settlements. So, were these attacks primarily about resistance to dispossession and displacement, or were they primarily about anti-Jewish racism and intolerance? Interestingly, while historians have consistently reported about various urban riots and massacres that happened in the 1920s and 30s, history books written for a general audience by historians on both sides of the conflict tend to ignore or gloss over these 70 years of clashes in rural areas. When they're reported, they're presented as peripheral to the conflict, and many times they're just not reported at all. And when they are mentioned in passing, the Jewish writers tend to either not explain why they happened, implying that it was intolerance, and when the Palestinian writers describe them, they tend to describe them as patriotic resistance, but again without really looking into these events in much detail. To find out about these clashes, you need to read specialized academic articles about Palestinian peasants, or about issues related to land and land acquisition, that have a tiny, mostly academic audience. Even politics heads are not often reading these texts. And for the general public in popular narratives, the kind that you might get from talking about the conflict with the average educated person on either side in the street, these clashes barely exist on their radar in their consciousness. And this is a huge red flag, because ultimately, the whole historical debate is about how Jews are accused of wanting to steal the land, and about how Arabs are accused of attacking the Jews out of intolerance. Well, here we have conflicts and attacks from the very beginning of Jewish settlement, and they go on for decades until the late 1930s. And 70% of the population of Palestine were peasants living in rural areas. And it was mostly their land that was ultimately taken by Israel in the War of 1948. So were those 70 years of clashes about defensive resistance to land theft? Or were they about aggressive racist intolerance toward Jews? It's like no one is even interested in looking at the events that can answer the fundamental question about the conflict that everyone is constantly arguing about. Why is everyone focusing on urban society when 70% of the population was rural? And most of the violence that occurred happened in rural areas. So these are the questions that we'll be asking and answering as we go. I mentioned earlier that we're going to see how elites screwed their own populations and put them on a path to endless conflict in the pursuit of their own ambitions and self-interests. So one of the lessons we'll be learning from this is to stop looking at societies as singular blorbs, like the Arabs as one blorb and the Jews as another blorb, but to pay attention to the different classes of people within the different societies. And the other related lesson is that where you have a class of people who make the major political and economic decisions, and they hold the key information that the rest of the population doesn't have, and they're in charge of disseminating information, the class of people with the power will make decisions in their own interests, even when it screws over the rest of the population. And while they're doing it, they'll be claiming that what they're doing is for the good of the rest of the population, and they'll probably believe it too. And that's one of the major themes of this whole show at the end of the day. And we'll see this play out over and over in the series and in future episodes about all sorts of topics. Human beings are limited creatures. We have limited knowledge, and we unconsciously understand the world through our own interests and our prejudices and our limited experiences. We lie to ourselves. We find moral justifications for doing bad things that benefit us. And when some people have power over other people, and they get to make decisions that the people with less power don't have a proportionate say in, whether the people with power have good intentions and pure hearts, or whether they're cartoon greedy goblins, the people with power will usually be making decisions that they think are the right ones, as interpreted through the lens of limited knowledge, self-deception, self-justification, and self-interest. Like, landlords will tend to think that the world will be better off if there are no rent controls, and they'll be attracted to economic theories that justify this. Everybody knows that rent control disincentivizes building housing, and it disincentivizes investment in maintaining buildings, and it causes housing shortages, and it causes people to harass their tenants. Those ideas just feel right to you if you're a landlord, because those ideas make you rich, justify you making more money. But if you're a tenant, these ideas just feel wrong. Like, there must be another way to create affordable housing than to make my life a hell tornado of having to move every 2 years because I keep getting pushed out of my apartments from exploding rents. And lower income tenants will tend to think that society in general will be better off with rent controls, and they'll be attracted to economic theories that justify this. Yes, rent control has some perverse incentives, but you can mitigate that with the right enforcement mechanisms and counter-incentives. And the negatives are far outweighed by the benefits in improved quality of life, where you're not having your life be a chaos tornado, where you're moving every year and working 7 jobs, also that you can have 90% of your income sucked away by some vampire pig landlord who provides no benefit to society whatsoever. And speaking of which, I'm going to be making an episode soon on how to solve the worldwide housing crisis in a way that keeps rents low forever and builds as much housing as we need. And it doesn't even cost the taxpayer anything in the long term. And when I'm not making podcasts, I'm a lawyer for tenants, so I have some idea of what I'm talking about here. So please see the show description for links to send me money so that I can afford to eat while I make that episode, which will improve everyone's life. But anyways, the point that we'll see over and over again throughout this series and this podcast is that when one group of people has unaccountable power over another group, over time, the group of people with power will benefit while the ones without will get screwed. And that works within ethnic groups just as it works between them. In order to understand the origins of the Israel-Palestine conflict, we need to understand the two worlds that end up colliding in Palestine once the Zionists start settling there in the 1880s. First, there's Palestine, with its majority Muslim Arab population, the vast majority of whom are peasant villagers, and with Christian, Jewish, Druze, and other minorities living there as part of the Ottoman Empire. And then there's the world of the Jews of Eastern Europe, who are the vast majority of the Jews who are immigrating to Palestine as part of the Zionist movement, but also before Zionism. In this episode, we're going to start off with the Jews in Europe, not because they're more important, but because most of the story plays out in Palestine. So we're going to be referring back to the structure and history of Palestinian society and the Ottoman Empire more often than we will be referring to the history of Jewish life in Europe. So it'll be easier for you to retain that information if it's presented closer to the main story. So, let the cartoon begin. Like I mentioned briefly last time, the Jews start off as a collection of Neolithic agro-pastoralist Hebrew tribes in the Levant area, and eventually they took over and established kingdoms in an area that's currently parts of Israel, the West Bank, Syria, and Western Jordan. And they eventually suffer 2 great military defeats and exiles, where they're kicked out of their kingdoms and deported en masse, where they eventually became the modern Jews. One happens about 600 BC, which sends the Jews to modern Iraq and Iran and Kurdistan, and the other great exile happens in 73 CE, which ends up sending Jews all over the world, including Europe, mostly in the south, with many of them being sold into slavery. And in the Jewish religion and culture, you have this idea that the true Jewish life was life in the land of Israel that was promised by God. And that life since then has been a fallen life of various kinds of subjugation at the hands of foreign peoples. And eventually, in Messianic times, the Jews are supposed to return and establish their kingdom in its original location once again. And all the way back to 900 AD, you have records of pious Jews going back to live in Eretz Israel, meaning the land of Israel, to either be buried or to live out their last years. And this idea of life outside of the land of Israel as being an exile has more salience in times and places where life was not good for the various Jewish communities of the world. Now, Jews have been in Europe since Roman times, about 2,000 years ago. Even before the Second Exile in 73 CE, you had established Jewish communities in southern Europe. In the city of Rome, you had an established Jewish community since the time of Augustus Caesar. And also, you had established communities all over Greece in the Hellenistic era. And after the second big exile, you have communities eventually moving up from Rome into Croatia and Germany and Russia and France and the Netherlands and England. And as we start heading into the Middle Ages, in the 800s and 900s, the center of European Jewry is in Germany, which the Jews called Ashkenaz, which is named after one of the great-grandsons of Noah, who is said to have settled and established a kingdom somewhere in Germany. And in medieval Germany in the 800s and 900s is where the Yiddish language is born, out of a mix of Middle High German and Hebrew and Aramaic. Aramaic is a Semitic language that was the common language spoken in Jesus' time. And Yiddish also incorporates Slavic languages, as Jewish communities expanded eastward into Poland and Lithuania and other places. And so the Jews of Northern and Western Europe become known as the Jews of Ashkenaz, and eventually as Ashkenazi Jews. There have been lots of theories floating around about how the Ashkenazi Jews are not even from the Middle East, and they're all from converted Khazars in Russia, where the monarchy and nobility converted to Judaism in the 8th or 9th century for reasons that aren't clear. It could have been to remain neutral between rival Muslim and Christian neighbors, or just a personal choice of the monarch. But either way, modern genetic testing shows that the Ashkenazi Jews have overwhelmingly Middle Eastern DNA on the male line, but overwhelmingly European DNA on the female line. This means that the early Jewish settlers in Europe were mostly men who married and converted local women, which is a pretty common migration pattern around the world for traders, which many of these European Jews were. They were establishing trading posts. At first, most of the Jews that you'd find in Europe were invited up there, primarily in Rome and around the Italian peninsula. And they were invited there by the local authorities to get access to trade goods and various urban trades that the Jews practiced. And when Ashkenazi Jews do 23andMe tests, they often have a lot of Italian DNA, which is from this period. Diaspora people are very often commerce people before the 20th century, because they're the ones who have contacts and relatives in far-flung places where you can get access to foreign goods to import. So people liked having Jews around because it meant that they would have a hookup to the hard-to-get trade goods. It's like having your Moroccan friend who brings in all the hashish. Later on, as Christianity rises and tries to establish itself across the Roman Empire, and then into the pagan areas of Europe, you have a concurrent rise of persecutions of Jews. This is not only because Jews are non-Christians, but because Jews reject the entire premise of Christianity entirely. They're like, no, we good. So Judaism in this period is seen as a threat to Christian domination and expansion, a negation of it. And despite the contents of the Christian Bible, which tend to be rather egalitarian and against wealth and power, Christianity, like most religions in great empires or most anti-authoritarian ideologies like socialism or communism, turns into an instrument to help pacify the lower classes. You have this hierarchical social order, where a small minority of nobility live from exploiting the hard work of the vast majority of the population. And this exploitation is justified as being part of God's will and God's plan, and the meek will get their reward in heaven. So everyone stay meek and keep your head down and keep giving your Lord and the state 30 to 50% of your labor and getting nothing in return. Napoleon Bonaparte once said, "I don't see in religion the evidence of the mystery of the incarnation, but rather the mystery of social order. Religion associates heaven with an idea of equality that keeps the rich from being massacred by the poor." But then you have these Jews running around who aren't part of this hierarchy at all. And they're not giving 50% of their labor to a lord or the king. They're prosperous traders and craftsmen and doctors, and they reject the entire premise of your religion. But they still believe in other parts of it that you might relate to. So why would you keep your head down and accept the Catholic hierarchy if there are people who are better off than you who don't accept it and don't bow their heads? You just convert to Judaism or become an atheist or a witch or something, and maybe you do a little peasant revolt here and there, and screw this great chain of being crap. So in order to keep Christian domination coherent, you needed the Jews to have special handicaps to remove that sort of threat that Jews pose to the ideological underpinning of the whole society. As a result, in Christian lands, Jews weren't allowed to own land or farm, and they were segregated to certain towns or areas of cities, away from the peasants. And eventually these came to be called ghettos in Italian or shtetls in Yiddish. And in many places, Jews had to wear special yellow badges or Jew hats, which was similar to the obligatory dress codes for Jews in many Islamic countries at the same time, for basically the same reasons. And all of this was in order to justify the social order. Interestingly, because of the prohibition on owning land or farming, meaning that Jews are almost all urban people, coupled with the fact that Jews are not a centralized religion at this point, and everyone is expected to pray and learn prayers and Torah passages. Because of this, Jews have a very high literacy rate in Europe. Like, you have to know how to read Torah in order to do your bar mitzvah. And the literacy rate is just huge compared to most other European peoples until the 19th century, where the vast majority of people are illiterate peasants. Now that Jews have these handicaps, even if some of the Jews are wealthier than you are, and you're a peasant, right? And the Jews can read, they're not a threat to your religious beliefs because they're spiritually loathsome and evil, and they're not allowed to do the Lord's honest labor of farming. And they're an entirely urban people. And peasants around the world usually see themselves as the ones who do the honest work, and they see urban people as engaging in swindling the peasant and swindling each other and exchanging money and seeking profits and doing all these evil things. And so it becomes easy for the peasants to believe that the Jews are evil and loathsome because the only Jews that they ever encountered were the ones farming taxes out of them and squeezing them with interest and loans. And those people probably were evil and loathsome. So the church creates this ideological hostility towards the Jews. And the fact that the only Jews that most Christians ever see are moneylenders and tax farmers and tax collectors instills just regular hostility in them towards the Jews. And it all feeds into the Christian narratives and serves the interests of the ruling classes of Europe. So when the peasants had had enough of being milked like cows, and they wanted to rebel against the forces that oppressed them, well, you could start a revolt against the nobility and the state, for whom the Jews were collecting taxes in the first place, but then you get slaughtered by the overwhelming forces of the state and the Lord. But if you went and took out your revenge on the Jewish ghettos and the people living there, who had nothing to do with exploiting you, well, then no one would stop you. The church would be happy that you're attacking their spiritual enemies, and the Lord would be happy that you're not attacking him. The end. Fortunately for the European Jews, Islam was spreading at this time right up into southern Europe. From the 8th century to the 15th century, much of Spain and Portugal were controlled by Muslim empires, and the region was known as al-Andalus. So in this period, as European Christianity is persecuting the Jews more and more Jews start moving to al-Andalus and other parts of the nearby Muslim world, which was in general a lot more tolerant of Jews in this period, and was also economically much more advanced and prosperous than Europe was at this time. So by 1000 AD, most of the world's Jews are in the Muslim world. And in al-Andalus, but also in other places, Muslim rulers were happy to have Jews for the same reason that Christian rulers used to be happy to have them. The Jews had connection to different places around the world, and they could bring in trade goods. And rich merchants were also a natural place to go to for loans and finance, so the Jews brought those services with them as well. Eventually, Western Europe starts getting more political consolidation, which allows for long-distance trade routes to open back up. And so eventually the source of wealth for the power of the ruling classes in Europe shifts from being mostly about stealing grain from the peasants, and more about commerce and having access to fancy trade goods from around the world. And as a result, more and more barons and nobles in Europe start inviting Jews to come back and settle in their Christian domains, rather than flee or be killed like the Muslims had to do. And they want them to stay because the Jews as a diaspora people have connections all around the world that no one else in most of Europe has, meaning connections to foreign trade goods. And unlike Christians who are forbidden to lend money for interest, Jews are allowed to do that. So Jews are a good source of much-needed cash loans that the ruling classes need in order to carry out their wars and buy foreign goods with. According to the Oxford Bibliography's entry on Jews in Medieval Europe, quote, "One of the results of this invigoration of the economies of Western Europe was the steady growth of the Jewish population of Western Christendom. As Christian armies eliminated the Muslim enclaves in Europe, Jews who had lived under Islamic rule, by and large, opted to stay on under Christian hegemony. In addition, areas of northern Europe that had no prior Jewish population began to attract Jewish settlers. In both cases, Jewish perceptions of the newly founded vigor of Christian Europe were reinforced by overtures from the rulers of Western Christendom. In the south, kings and barons offered Jews benefits for remaining in their former homes. In the north, governmental authorities extended protection and support to Jewish immigrants. The result was a rapidly increasing set of Jewish settlements. The Jews of medieval Western Christendom encountered difficult circumstances, both societal hostility grounded in the traditional Christian anti-Jewish imagery, constricted economic opportunities, serious church pressure for limitations on Jewish life, and significant church-sponsored missionizing campaigns, and overdependence on the governmental authorities, which could eventuate in despoliation and expulsion. By the end of the 14th century, the Jews of England and France had been banished, and the Middle Ages closed with the expulsion of the Jews of Spain in 1492. But on the most basic level, the number of Jews in Europe expanded continuously, eventually bringing European Jewry to parity with the older Jewish communities of the Islamic sphere, and then subsequently, in the early modern centuries, to demographic dominance in the Jewish world. These Jews of medieval Europe fashioned effective structures of self-government and created a rich new Jewish culture, deeply rooted in their creative medieval European ambiance. End quote. So, basically the church is spreading anti-Jewish hostility, as is the role of Jews as tax collectors and moneylenders. But at the same time, the nobility are inviting Jews in and giving them protection, and allowing them to trade and prosper. And also, Jews are engaging in various urban trades, providing services, like acting as doctors. And then, every once in a while, like if the baron or king borrowed too much money and didn't want to pay it back, or if the peasants were getting too unhappy, the rulers would withdraw that protection and let the masses rip against the Jews, or else they'd have all the Jews expelled from their lands, or both. So you take an ideologically reviled group that's a threat to your ruling ideology, and you give them exclusive monopoly over the most hated positions in society. And it's a way for the nobility to control finance, so that finance doesn't control them. It's a way of making sure that moneylenders don't have too much power over the ruling class, and so that they don't become the ruling class. Now, as Europe urbanizes, the Jews of Europe develop a very peculiar class structure relative to many other cultures around the world. On the one hand, you had this tiny minority who started off as wealthy merchants and then became extraordinarily wealthy moneylenders. Like they were lending money to the kings of Europe to finance their wars. And then you had a middle class of smaller, more local merchants, or people involved in various urban trades. And sometimes they serviced neighboring communities, or they serviced their own Jewish communities. But as the Middle Ages went on, a rising Christian middle class grew with the urbanization, and they didn't want these Jewish competitors. So the church and the rulers imposed more and more restrictions on Jews, where over time, Jews couldn't even engage in various trades anymore, especially not outside of the Jewish ghettos and towns. And as a result of this, you end up with a society that has a tiny, ultra-wealthy, rich class, a shrinking middle class of self-employed shopkeepers and hustlers, and then because there was no peasant class and not much of an employee or proletarian class, the majority of Jews were in this big and growing class of people who live by hustling, or by charity, or by being thieves. The schnorrer and the gonef, the beggar and the thief, are two big archetypes in European Jewish literature. According to Jewish religious law, beggars are very much entitled to specific types of charity and generosity from the wealthy. Like if you're having a wedding with lots of food, you're obliged to feed any beggars who show up. Or if you own a hotel, you're obligated to house beggars and poor people when you have rooms that aren't being rented. And because of these entitlements to charity, and because of the massive numbers of people who depended on charity, you had actual unions of schnorrers, where the union representative would go to a wedding of a wealthy Jew and demand a certain payment so that the wedding party isn't overrun by hungry, impoverished beggars. And then that payment would be shared among all the members and the poor. And you'd have similar practices for hotels and other situations where Jewish law mandates sharing with the poor. And those unions and those payments still exist today among Hasidic Jews. And schnorrers and their sense of entitlement were a big source of jokes among Jews in the 19th and early 20th centuries. I actually found some, and they made me laugh. Quote, Moshe the schnorrer is outraged to hear that his wealthy patron has halved his annual allowance. The donor apologetically explains that his son has married a woman of expensive tastes, and that he, the father, must foot the bill. "He can marry who he wants," retorts the Schnorr, "just not with my money." Or another one that was in a collection by Sigmund Freud. The Schnorr begged the Baron for some money for a journey to an expensive resort in Ostend, in Belgium, because his doctor had recommended sea bathing for his troubles. The Baron thought Ostend was a particularly expensive resort. A cheaper one would do equally well. The Schnorrer, however, rejected the proposal with the words, "Herr Baron, I consider nothing too expensive for my health." As for the Gonif culture, the thieves, there was an extensive underworld of thieves in medieval and early modern Europe, with its own guilds and hierarchy and rules. They even had a special secret language called Rotwelsch, which was a mix of German and Yiddish and Roma and Czech, all the rejects of Europe. And aside from the thieves, the vast number of poor and unemployed Jews, and the Jewish communities as a whole, were very dependent on the rich moneylender Jews for their survival. And now that Jews were no longer allowed to work in most trades, the segregation between Jews and non-Jews increased significantly. Before those prohibitions, Christians might have had some good relations with a Jewish tradesperson or merchant or doctor. But now, the only Jews they were ever likely to encounter were moneylenders, tax collectors, beggars, and thieves. So with this deterioration of conditions, the Jews of Ashkenaz migrated east to countries that were more accepting of Jews. In particular, the nobility of Poland and Lithuania were very friendly to Jews and welcomed Jewish immigration. And they imposed less restrictions there than in most of the rest of Europe. You could even be a Jewish farmer and landowner in Lithuania, for example. So you have a mass migration of Ashkenazi Jews coming from Western to Eastern Europe as the Middle Ages progress. And Warsaw and Vilnius become the cultural and spiritual centers of Jewish Europe in the East, with huge Jewish populations. Meanwhile, Amsterdam becomes known as the Jerusalem of Europe in the West, as the Netherlands were also very tolerant of Jews, because it was one of the centers of European commerce. Meanwhile, just east of Poland, you have Russia, which is extremely hostile to Jews and very restrictive towards them. Now eventually, with the printing press, and the Protestant Reformation, which splits the dominance of the Catholic Church, and then with more urbanization and secularization of European societies, and with the Enlightenment that grows out of this, and especially with the French Revolution, which challenges the political and religious hierarchies of Europe, there's no longer the same political and religious need to keep Jews excluded from European society. So by the end of the 18th century, with the rise of liberal ideas about equality, these restrictions on Jews start to be repealed, and Jews are emancipated in various countries, meaning they're given equal rights. And in Western Europe, in the more prosperous countries, middle-class Jews start to become well integrated into their local societies. And they're practicing the various professions and engaging in commerce without restriction. And there you have the phenomenon of the Frenchman or German of the Mosaic faith, the Jew who is culturally very much like his Christian neighbors, except he doesn't eat pork and doesn't celebrate Christmas and goes to temple on Saturdays instead of church on Sundays. But this emancipation doesn't happen in the Russian Empire, which is still largely dominated by the Orthodox Church, and which still has a largely medieval social structure into the 20th century, where you have a divinely appointed monarch and a nobility and a dependent peasantry. And in Russia, Jews aren't emancipated until the February Revolution of 1917. Now, because Poland and Lithuania were so friendly to Jews, and because Russia was so hostile towards them, there weren't actually many Jews living in the Russian Empire until the late 18th century. What happens at that time is that the Russian Empire starts expanding out westwards and swallows up Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Moldova, and Belarus, where there were large populations of Jews, many of whom at this point had been there for almost 800 years, sometimes more. So here, you end up with some of the historically best places to be Jewish, getting taken over by an empire that's one of the worst places to be a Jew. And once Russia takes control over these territories, they impose harsh medieval restrictions on the Jews, which strangled and impoverished their communities, much as had been the case in the rest of Europe in the Middle Ages. So once again, Jews weren't allowed to own land. They were barred from most professions. They were relegated to only commerce and certain trades. They were only allowed to live in a region called the Pale of Settlement, which was mostly the western end of the Russian Empire, where the Jews already were, and they had to pay special Jew taxes and fees. They needed special permits to travel, and there were small and strict quotas on which Jews could attend university. So just as Jews in Western Europe were beginning to enjoy prosperity and equality and new freedoms, the once prosperous and relatively free Jewish communities of Central and Eastern Europe suddenly plunged back into medieval poverty and second-class status. A flourishing middle class of professionals, merchants, and tradesmen suddenly becomes a huge beggar class. So in terms of the class structure of Jews in Eastern Europe, in the Pale of Settlement area, you ended up with 1/3 of Jews living entirely off of charity. And to get a sense of the scale of poverty in Eastern Europe, you can read stories by Sholem Aleichem, a popular Yiddish writer who wrote a lot of funny stories about Eastern European Jewish life. And he's the one who wrote the story that Fiddler on the Roof is based on. And he has a story called An Easy Fast about a scholar who makes up religious reasons to fast 2 days each week because there's not enough food to eat for 7 days a week. Or if you want a sense of the Jewish criminal underworld that ballooned in the Pale of Settlement era, you can read Motka Gonef, translated as Motka the Thief or Motka the Vagabond by Solomon Asch, which is a bit of a scandalous look at the life of a poor Jew in Warsaw, going from being a thief to a carny to a pimp and a brothel owner. So in the East, you get the expansion of the Russian Empire, which is plunging Jewish life into darkness. And in the West, you're getting Jewish emancipation and integration into general society. But at the same time as this is happening, in the 19th century, you also have the rise of nationalism all across Europe, East and West. So what is nationalism? There's been a ton of ink spilled on nationalism and theories of nationalism, but for me, the most productive way to understand nationalism is that nationalism is simply a form of group identity that people adopt, or that some people try to corral other people into adopting, which is used in order to achieve certain goals. And in the case of nationalism, the goals usually revolve around the state, be it forming a state, expanding a state, defending a state, or maintaining the stability of the state. Human beings are social animals, and we have an evolved mechanism for group identity. That identity can be family, tribe, religion, social class, gender, skin color, basketball teams, music genres, goths, punks, sexual preference groups, neighborhoods, age cohorts like millennials versus boomers versus Gen X and Gen Z, and political ideology, and anything else you can imagine. And it would seem that our group identity has a competition/hostility to outgroups built into it. Some famous studies in the 1970s showed that if you take a room full of people and divide them into totally arbitrary groups, like by eye color, or you divide them by people who are wearing different colored t-shirts or hats, or even just saying to half the room, you're in group A, and the other half, you're in group B, people very quickly, and for no rational reason whatsoever, start inferring good intentions and good qualities onto the people of their group, even though they've never met them until 5 minutes ago, and they start becoming suspicious and inferring bad motives and qualities into the other group of people that they've also never met until 5 minutes before. So in this light, group identity seems to mostly have evolved for war and competition over resources versus other groups, to take over other people's territories, or to defend yourself from being taken over. Or else it serves in struggles between the genders, like you see in egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies, where men and women's ritual associations try to assert the interest of each other's genders and try to keep each other from dominating. And it makes sense that collective identity would be totally arbitrary. Our ancestral groups were also largely arbitrary. People think of tribes or clans as natural groupings because the people in them are related. But in most of these tribal societies, you're ignoring basically half of your relatives. Like you have societies where you're part of your father's tribe and all your male relatives on the male line, but you're not part of your mother's tribe and all of her relatives up on her line, even though you're just as related to them, or vice versa. Or as we'll see when we look into the tribal structures of societies in the Middle East, someone who's your competitor and outgroup enemy in one context becomes your close in-group ally in battle, risking his life for you in another context. Meanwhile, you can also see in the world around you solidarity within collective identity groups that are completely genetically diverse, like multiracial societies like Israelis and Palestinians, for example. Right? Palestinians have a whole rainbow of genes. If you go there, you see black people and red-haired, blue-eyed people, and the same thing in Israel. Or Americans versus Soviets. And this probably has to do with the nature of our ancestral hunter-gatherer bands, where membership was fluid, and where people in the same band were often not actually closely related to each other at all. When we come up with group identities, we're coming up with allies and insiders, people that we want to join up with for various reasons, versus outsiders, people that we are in conflict with, or else that we ignore. This presupposes some kind of common interest that ties your identity group together, even though you might have other interests that divide you. So like, you might have someone who's a landlord and then his tenant in the 1950s, and they have nothing in common and they hate each other. But they both have dark skin, and they would identify as Black Americans, an arbitrary, genetically diverse group that's based on superficial skin color and not very much else. And even if this tenant and landlord have very little in common genetically, having ancestors from different parts of Africa and the US, and even though they might hate each other and have opposing interests as landlord versus tenant on a day-to-day basis, they would likely unite under the banner of Black identity in order to campaign or to vote for the same civil rights legislation that would benefit both of them. And they would need to do that because another identity group, whites, another fake group whose members have nothing real in common and are totally genetically unrelated to each other, and these whites might be enemies as a business owner and a union member on strike. Well, the blacks need to join together because the whites earlier joined together in order to exclude the Black identity group from all sorts of civil rights. So, nationalism is the application of this group identity psychology to a group involving a nation, and usually a nation state. And since ancient times, a nation meant an ethnic group, people with common language and other important cultural practices, despite important divisions like tribe or political units. So sometimes the ancient Greeks are described as a nation, even though they were constantly fighting each other via various city-states. Or else the ancient Hebrews are considered a nation, even though they were divided into 12, often opposing and conflicting tribes. In the modern context, the idea of the nation has usually been invoked in terms of a group that's supposed to be unified under a common state. In the 19th century, the idea of nationalism was most often about a single ethnic group forming a state, but you also later developed multi-ethnic nationalisms, like in the United States or the Soviet Union. And like I said earlier, it's often involved in forming a state, expanding a state, defending a state, or maintaining the stability of the state, particularly against various divisions that you find in hierarchical societies, like class divisions, gender divisions, religious divisions, etc. Now, when it comes to identity politics, like nationalism in the context of hierarchical societies, the class dimension is something that is absolutely crucial to pay attention to. If you're just one person, you just need to figure out what's in your own interest and then act on it. But if you're in a group of people, different members of the group might have different interests. In an egalitarian hunter-gatherer band where everyone has to cooperate to survive and everyone is economically and politically equal, individuals' interests can sometimes conflict. Like when it comes to, oh, I want her to be my girlfriend, and no, I don't want him to be my boyfriend, I want him to be, stuff like that. But when it comes to decisions affecting the whole group, individual and group interests tend to converge, because everyone's situation tends to be pretty similar. If we all put in the effort to go on a hunt, we all get more meat. If your group takes over an enemy territory, you all get better land and more land. And you also benefit if your band gathers together to defend against an enemy trying to push you out of your territory. But things are very different in a hierarchical society, where you have large groups of people within that society that live in very different situations and conditions from each other, and where people very often have directly contradictory interests to each other. In these societies, decisions that affect the entire group affect different classes of people very differently. Landlords are better off when rents are high and housing supply is low. Tenants are better off when rents are low and housing supply is high. Employees are better off when wages are high and the availability of workers is low, and business owners are better off when wages are low and there's a big surplus of people looking for jobs. Weapons manufacturers and certain industries might be better off if the country goes off to engage in some far-off war and spend zillions of dollars on that, but lower-class young men who have to go and fight and die in that war, and the people who depend on public social programs whose budgets get cuts to fund these wars, those people are worse off. Now, according to those identity studies I mentioned, when identity is invoked, we automatically have a tendency to infer common interest with our identity group, no matter how artificial and nonsensical that group is. And we instinctively infer a conflict of interest with the outside group. These instincts served us well when we lived in egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies, but these instincts serve us very poorly in class societies where people from the same ethnic group often have completely antagonistic interests. So a very typical example is a king or lord in the Middle Ages who wanted to expand his territory so that he could get more serfs that he could milk like cows. He might conscript his own serfs to fight for him, and they might be compelled to sacrifice their lives and die for basically no advantage whatsoever to themselves, besides a little adventure and some pillage loot. Meanwhile, the lord gets all the advantage without risking his life or health or status as a parasite lord. So what you often see in class societies is people from higher classes invoking a common identity with people in the lower classes, often nationality or religion, in order to achieve goals that benefit the upper class, but that might harm the lower class. And often invoking foreign threats is one of the most effective ways of doing this. Oh, we need to crack down on labor organizing because labor organizers are secret Soviet agents and they're disrupting our economy and they're dividing us and leaving us vulnerable to the Soviets taking over. Having unions roll over dead for employers, that benefits America. That's the type of stuff you got during the Cold War from American politicians with enthusiastic support of major employers and bosses. Meanwhile, the ruling class in the Soviet Union would say, well, we can't have democracy, because if we do, the capitalist agents will infiltrate and take over our state. The one-party system benefits everyone. Same piss, different bottles. So, the advent of democracy causes problems for the upper classes of Europe. For 1,000 years or so, you had the traditional feudal system, with the monarch and nobility ruling over the peasants and commoners, and this was justified and lubricated by the ideology of the church. And then over time you have the rise of the business and commerce classes, who become wealthier than many of the nobility, and eventually they push them out of the way with the help of various revolutions across Europe. And these revolutions might have initially intended to establish a democratic, more egalitarian regime, but most often, after some revolutionary spits and spurts, instead of a democracy, you would end up with a new kind of monarch in power who would rule with and sort of for the business class, which is what happened with the French Revolution, when you eventually get Napoleon. Or else you'd get a state that was supposedly democratic, but with really high property qualifications to vote, so only the wealthiest business people and nobility would get to vote, which is what you had in England in the early 19th century. And at the same time as the business class is rising, you're getting the Industrial Revolution, which is taking the peasant class and throwing them off their land and turning them into a growing propertyless proletariat, people who own nothing of value except their own labor. And these people are forced to rent themselves out to business owners to be used to generate the business owners' profits. In other words, the working class. In other words, most humans alive today. And in the 19th century, this urban working class starts forming the labor movement. And they also form the backbone of the socialist movement, together with some of the intellectual class. And over time, thanks to pressure from socialist and labor movements together, and pressure from the growing middle classes, the business monarchies, or representative democracies for the rich systems, these give way to states with universal male voting and later universal adult voting. Now, for a long time, the upper classes were terrified of representative democracy, because it seemed intuitive that if the general population got to vote, they'd just vote to take all the power and wealth away from the upper classes and then redistribute it and give it to themselves. And that wasn't just conjecture, it was also very much the explicit program of much of the socialist movement, for workers to directly control their workplaces and their government, instead of all the rich people doing so. So the upper classes had to figure out various strategies to prevent this, and to maintain their wealth and power inside of a representative democratic system that could potentially allow the population to legitimately, meaning legally, without violent revolution, take that wealth and power away from the rich. And we'll talk about these different strategies a bunch in later episodes on the show, but one of the strategies that the upper classes figured out to help them maintain their wealth and power is that they could use nationalism and nationalist ideas and symbols to frame the world in a way that obscures class divisions and minimizes people's awareness or understandings of the inherent conflicts of interest between employees and employers, between the rich and the poor in general. Of course, nationalism isn't just a conspiracy to erase class consciousness. In many ways, nationalism came from the professional and middle classes first, before it was adopted by certain sections of the wealthy. In 19th century Europe, many people in the professional and middle classes saw nationalism as their ticket to gain positions of power and influence via elected government. At that time, most of the governments of Europe were monarchies, or else multinational empires, where power was based on birthright. So the nationalist idea was that instead of these monarchies or multinational empires, what you wanted was for each ethnic group to break off into their own representative democratic states, where people would be unified by language and culture. and the middle classes will be the perfect ones to run these states and represent the nation as elected officials and bureaucrats and administrators. Unlike the majority lower classes, the middle class had the education and skills needed to govern. And meanwhile, they're self-made and meritocratic, and not simply inheritors of wealth like the stupid upper classes. At first, much of the business class was less interested in nationalism than they were in liberalism, ideas of secular states with equal rights before the law for all, meaning with no special privileges for the nobility or for people of a specific religion. And also, these states should be economically liberal, meaning the government isn't handing out the right to do commerce as a special privilege. And also, there should be a regime of property rights that allows rich people to amass unlimited amounts of property. And it allows for wealthy owners of capital to boss around a servile class of propertyless workers who are forced to rent themselves out to survive. But over time, many among the elite classes, both the business class and some of the downwardly mobile nobility, find that nationalism is an extremely handy tool to help them maintain their power and wealth in the face of a newly empowered and hungry and increasingly organized working class. One of the main themes I've been talking about in this podcast is that elites will always try to pervert any popular idea into an idea that advances the interests of the wealthy and powerful. Nationalism sort of inherently advances the interests of elites by blurring class lines. But elites will adopt even the most anti-authoritarian ideologies like communism, Christianity, feminism, punk rock, gangster rap, anything you can think of, and they'll turn any threat to power into idiotic garbage that supports the people in power. Like I mentioned earlier, when you divide people into groups, even nonsense arbitrary groups, people start to feel solidarity with their group and antagonism for other groups. So if you have people uniting on national lines, and you veer their antagonism onto other nations, you reduce class conflict by making hungry, underpaid workers identify with their flag-waving bosses and landlords and business leaders. In the feudal system, ethnicity usually didn't matter so much. It was common to have multinational kingdoms and empires in Europe, as in the rest of the world. It was religion that usually played the role of justifying the social hierarchy in the eyes of the lower classes. And many of the big wars that plagued Europe since the Protestant Revolution were fought between Catholics and Protestants within the same ethnic groups. But in a democratic system, in a secularizing society where the church's influence is waning, and where the lower classes can get elected and overthrow the upper classes using the power of the state, you need a different organizing principle other than religion to unite people and tamp down class divisions in a hierarchical society. So in the 19th century, that principle was nationalism, that people should be organized according to ethno-linguistic group. And it makes sense in the era of increasing communications and literacy that you'd have polities, meaning political decision-making units, you'd have polities based on common language. In the era of monarchies and empires, with no newspapers and largely illiterate peasant populations, you didn't need sophisticated political debates or knowledge facilitated by a common language and literacy. You just needed people to bow their heads and believe and obey the people who were stronger than they were. But in the 19th century, you had to deal with democracy, and the idea that people should have a say, and that therefore people should engage in debate, and that people need knowledge about things. And nationalism was in competition with socialism, which wanted people to organize across national lines, on a class basis, and which wanted to form a global classless community, where everyone governs themselves, and isn't bossed around by business owners or the ruling class of the state. People forget about all these aspects of socialism because of the authoritarian state direction that socialism eventually went in. But in the 19th century that we're talking about, one of the core ideas of popular socialism was that the state was just a machine for the business class or for feudal classes to control society with. And 19th century socialists imagined a world of self-governing stateless societies. Now, the rise of nationalism in Europe is very important to our Israel-Palestine conflict story because Zionism is a form of nationalism, and because Zionism and later Arab nationalism become central to the story, but also because along with the rise of nationalism across Europe came the rise of a new wave of anti-Semitism across Europe. And this is no coincidence. First of all, if your polity is based on your ethnic group, and you're emphasizing that ethnic and national identity constantly, minorities from outside that identity group immediately become an outsider group. And we talked about just before that our brains seem to impugn hostile motives to outside groups, just like we see in those experiments from the 1970s. That's one reason that a lot of the identity politics today is so toxic. On the surface, it seems to champion left-wing equality. But what it actually does is it constantly stimulates our us versus them instincts in our brains in between every social group. And in many ways, just like nationalism was in part a way of erasing class, today's obsession with identity politics is actually a right-wing project of erasing class conflict and bolstering the power of the rich and upper middle classes, but it's disguised as a left-wing movement with egalitarian concerns. And you can watch episodes 9.2 or 9.1 on this. Anyhow, if your aim as part of the 19th century rising business class and downwardly mobile nobility class is to tamp down the movement for democracy and to suffocate the movement for labor rights and for socialism, you'll notice that Jews are prominently at the forefront of all of those movements, in particular liberalism, the labor movement, and the movement for socialism. As a minority that's constantly been oppressed by the very nature of the traditional religious and social hierarchies of Europe, Jews tended to be very interested in advancing the causes of freedom and democracy and secularization of the state, and as people who are discriminated against by religion and ethnicity, and among whom you have a great number of people living in enormous poverty, and where you have a very communal outlook with a very developed mutual aid and welfare system, like the charity system I was talking about, and where the members of your ethnic group live all over Europe, speaking all sorts of different languages. The appeal of international socialism was just natural and obvious. And if your aim is to create a polity on the basis of common identity, and you have these Jews all across Europe in different countries, but who share a separate identity that crosses national boundaries, well, inherently that group is going to be a threat to your whole idea of nationalism. And on top of that, you have so many of its members advocating international socialism, which is the opposite of nationalism. And actually, it's worth commenting on because it comes up later, and also just because it's interesting. And that's that in Jewish society in Europe at this time, despite having these extreme wealth disparities, with these ultra-rich financiers and this giant poor schnorrer and hustler class, the society is actually weirdly egalitarian, in the sense that most people don't have a boss. The class composition of European Jews in the 18th and 19th centuries is made up of financiers, merchants of all kinds, from super wealthy jewel importers to small shopkeepers, to extremely poor door-to-door rag salesmen, to professionals like doctors and lawyers, to tradespeople, to thieves and hustlers and pimps, and the giant schnorrer charity class. And the charity beggar class is unusual in that the bulk of their charity is an entitlement, not a gift. So aside from when you're learning your trade as a journeyman, or you're studying to be a professional, or the situation of some employees, but this is before the Industrial Revolution, so you don't have a ton of employees, most Jews just don't ever have anyone telling them what to do in the way that people in most big civilizations have. And this sort of egalitarianism and sense of entitlement was much more prominent in the Russian Empire Palest settlement era, because there you had all these middle-class people who were prosperous and independent, who suddenly got wiped out into the beggar class very quickly. So they still had a strong sense of self-worth, and you didn't have time for that culture of deference to develop the way that it does in the lower classes of most big civilizations. And so, the masses of unemployed Jews who were living off charity and hustling, but who despite being poor as dirt were their own boss and never had anyone tell them what to do besides their mothers. In urban centers, they started joining the ranks of the urban proletariat as the 19th century went on, and they started experiencing the brutality of the 19th century workforce, where you're in total servile status, where you do what you're told or you starve. For these new workers, the benefits and wisdom of socialism, where workers are supposed to control the workplace and elect their own bosses, and where the community takes care of each other and provides for the needy, all of these things seem self-evident. I couldn't find any proper numbers, but when you read socialist history, you see a lot of Jewish names at the heads of all sorts of socialist parties and organizations, all across Europe, in France and Russia, everywhere, way beyond the proportions in society. And that's for all the reasons that I just described. And when you watch an episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm, and you see a bunch of Jewish people yelling at each other at the table in every episode, that's where this comes from. Unlike most other civilizations, where you have a very clear political hierarchy, where everyone has to kiss somebody's ass and show deference in order to survive, the Jews don't really have to kiss anybody's ass, or not as much. And even the schnorrer is demanding that the baron give him his money, instead of wasting it on his own son. And people can just speak their minds and be as honest or as rude as they like with each other without catastrophic consequences. And it's a bit analogous to like when you go to different artist communities in different cities. When you meet musicians or artists that are sort of just doing their own thing in weird obscurity, they're often very frank and honest, or rude depending on your perspective. But if you go to LA, where there's this huge Hollywood apparatus, this hierarchy that everyone wants to be a part of, Everyone there is really friendly to the point of being phony baloney. They're all kissing each other's ass and not telling each other what they actually think of each other. And they never name names. There's a big joke on the podcast where somebody's bitching about someone that's like, oh yeah, tell me who it is. What's the name? And they'll never say it, because to speak ill of anyone can get you a reputation as a troublemaker, which can fuck up your career. So no one ever speaks their mind in a disparaging way about anyone except with their closest friends. If you work in a corporation, you live in the same kind of politeness culture. Or if you're a waitress, or if you work in any number of jobs in hierarchical organizations. Because speaking your mind will get you fired, or in LA it'll get you blacklisted. Like when someone who's been a self-employed independent artist for years, or someone who's been on welfare for a long time, has to go work in a fast food place or in an office, they usually get in trouble and fired really fast, because they're offending the shit out of everyone without even realizing it. I've been in that situation myself. And the boss is mad because you see yourself as the center of the universe instead of seeing him and his needs as the center of the universe. And I'm talking about this because we'll see this dynamic come into play in Palestine when the European Jews are trying to deal with the Arabs and later the British, which are both very deferential politeness cultures. So the fact that you had this Jewish minority in Europe at the time of rising nationalism, which had among its members a high number of prominent financiers and capitalists, but also a high proportion of socialists and communists, and also a large number of prominent liberals, basically all the major movements advocating for change and against the traditional hierarchies of Europe. This was, and still is, great material for conspiracy theories. Whether you're into socialism or capitalism, or you're for monarchy and the church, if you don't like what's happening in society, there is an anti-Semitic conspiracy for you. And just like a lot of the popular conspiracy theories of our day, the 19th century anti-Semitic conspiracies, which are actually going through a bit of a resurgence over the last decade or so, are a great way of taking people's anti-capitalist feelings, like the hostility that people have against big business for throwing them off their farms or out of their independent trades and into the meat grinder of urban factories. Well, anti-Semitism is a great way to neutralize those hostile feelings and channel them into something that is either no threat to big business or that actually helps big business. So nationalists would go to Christian workers who are upset about the negative effects of capitalism and who might be attracted to socialism and labor activism, and they'd say, hey, if you're mad at the effects of capitalism, don't join these socialist labor organizations. They're run by the Jews. And the Jews are the same ones who are also running capitalism that you hate. And all of this is just a conspiracy to destroy our society from all angles at once. What you need to do is align with us Chad, patriotic, nationalist, Christian, businessmen, alpha sigmas. We care about the nation. And the nation is just great benevolent businessmen like us, and poor, hardworking peasants and craftsmen and workers like you. We're all on the same team, and we'll take care of you and protect you from the pincers of the evil Jewish lobster octopus. And you have the same conspiracies going on today, left over and reanimated from the 19th century. And this is why anti-Semitism has been referred to as the socialism of fools. Socialism, at least the better 19th century strands of it, provides a set of explanations through which workers can understand the forces that are oppressing us. And then it proposes a solution where workers take power for ourselves and we run society democratically by and for ourselves. Meanwhile, anti-Semitism provides a series of explanations for the problems of the world that not only don't help you understand what's actually happening to you, or what you can do about it, these theories also push you into giving away your power and your support to the very people that are causing all of your problems in the first place. So, anti-Semitism was just a perfect ideology for all of these conservative forces wanting to maintain their power over the rising movements for democracy, liberalism, and socialism. In the words of Charles Maurras, the 19th and 20th century right-wing nationalist, monarchist, and anti-Semitic philosopher and activist, quote, "Everything seems impossible or terribly difficult without the providential appearance of anti-Semitism. It enables everything to be arranged, smoothed over, and simplified. If one were not an anti-Semite through patriotism, one would have to become one through a simple sense of opportunity." Unquote. Basically, he's saying, if anti-Semitism didn't exist, we'd have to make it up because it's just so damn useful to our goals. In the words of French historian Michel Winock, this was the true political function of anti-Semitism. As soon as indigent mobs, small businessmen, and artisans victimized by the economic evolution, exploited workers and peasants forced to leave the countryside, were shown the Jew was responsible for all their ills, social conservatives had an inestimable weapon. Deriving strength from their control of the press, they orchestrated the developing myth for their own use. Class conflicts vanished. There was now nothing but the minority of Jewish profiteers crushing the vast majority of their Aryan and Catholic victims." Unquote. And very important, and we'll talk about this more when I get back on my series The Russian Revolution. One of the reasons that anti-Semitism was so successful in gaining support away from socialism or liberalism was that Marxism, the most popular form of socialism, was idiotically hostile towards peasants, who were still the majority of the population, or like half of the population in Europe in the 19th century, depending on where you were. When Marxists talk about the working classes, they're not talking about peasants and farmers and people who work. They're talking about urban employees. Because of this hostility against peasants, the peasants who were also the ones being turned into the proletarians, so these peasants and proletarians were more attracted to things like nationalist and religious parties, and later to fascist parties, than they were to socialist parties, because those nationalist and fascist parties actually reached out to them, while the Marxist parties tended to idiotically see the peasants as their natural enemies. And we'll see more about this in my next episode on the Russian Revolution, but I suspect that if Marxism hadn't had this anti-peasant bias, then most of Western Europe would have had successful socialist revolutions after World War I, instead of all the failed revolutions that took place across the continent from Hungary to Finland to Italy to Greece and Spain and Ireland. Anyhow, Wienok continues, quote, "In establishing anti-Semitism as a system of universal explanation, the anti-Semitic writers made the Jew the negative pole of nationalist movements. It was in relation to the Jew, against the Jew, that nationalists defined their French or German identity. The nationalists made the Jew the negative pole of nationalist movements." Unquote. And so, in the words of John Gans, whose Substack is where I got these quotes from, and his articles are called The Socialism of Fools and Some Thoughts on Anti-Semitism, John Gans says, quote, "The boogeyman of the Jew is what unifies Germans who are Protestant and Catholic, or owners and workers, nobility and peasants." Unquote. Now, in the early 19th century, there are also some just plain socialist fools. Early socialists like Charles Fourier, Alphonse Toussenel, and Pierre-Joseph Proudhon were virulent anti-Semites because they thought that the Jews as a race were one of the main causes of the advances of capitalism. And some scholars argue that it was anti-capitalism that first translated traditional Christian anti-Semitism into the more modern 19th century form, and anti-capitalism is often socialism. But regardless, it was the right wing and the nationalists who took anti-Semitism to the bank, pun intended, and who really made it the core of their ideology. So the term anti-Semitism doesn't mean just discrimination or racism against Jews. It's a specific conspiracy ideology where the Jews are responsible for all the chaos of the times. And in the 19th century, that chaos is the chaos of industrialization and capitalism throwing people out of their farms or out of their trades and out of self-employment and self-sufficiency and into the urban slums and into servile labor. And it's also the chaos caused by the labor struggles and the civil wars for democracy and the threat of chaotic socialist revolutions like the Paris Commune of 1870. And world over, it's a solid classic invoked by elites to divert people from the real problems and solutions facing them. And note that the label anti-Semitism was a label that the anti-Semites themselves made. And they called it anti-Semitism instead of anti-Judaism in order to focus on the foreign origin of the Jews. The Semites being the people from the Middle East and Africa, Jews, Arabs, and Ethiopians who speak Semitic languages. And the reason we don't call racism against Arabs or Ethiopians anti-Semitism, even though they're Semitic peoples, is that anti-Semitism isn't just racism, it's a specific type of conspiracy theory that doesn't apply to Arabs and Ethiopians. So like today, if someone is saying, "Oh, I hate those Jews with their big noses and giant penises, and they are so good at basketball and rap music," that's just regular anti-Jewish racism. But if you're saying like, "The Jews are putting microplastics in our cereal to turn all our kids trans and non-binary so they can vote for gay, open borders, for all the Mexicans to come in and breed with our women and to eliminate the white race," that's anti-Semitism. Now, nationalism isn't all just racism and exclusion. In the multinational empires like the Russian Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, nationalism was also a means of gaining more independence and democracy within the ruling empire. In multinational empires, rulers would use nationalism as a means of pumping up dominant ethnic groups to keep hold of subject groups, or to conquer new subjects. Meanwhile, for the subject groups, they would use nationalism as a way to seek freedom from exploitation by the dominant empire. Again, it's the two evolved functions of group identity that I mentioned: offensive expansion and genocide, or else self-defense from someone else's expansion and genocide. And today, when we think of nationalism coming from minority communities in big empires or bigger countries, we imagine that their goal is to establish an independent nation-state. But in the 19th century, the nationalists from the minority communities in the great empires developed theories of nationalism where the minorities would gain autonomy, but within the multinational empire. And the multinational empire would continue to exist, not as an exploitation machine dominating all the smaller nations within it, but rather as a democratic body for coordinating defense and economic activities between its member nations. A bit like the EU, but more centralized. Kind of like the US, except with the states each being different homelands for the various ethnic groups, with more autonomy than US states. So something in between the US and the EU. And we'll get back to this a bit regarding Zionism, which starts off very much along these lines, as a movement seeking a state inside of a broader multinational empire. Now, for the Jews of Europe, they're reacting to all of these changes: the industrialization, the secularization, the class conflict, the nationalism, the democratization, and the anti-Semitism. They're reacting to this stuff in various ways. And the main ones are assimilation and integration, socialism, Jewish nationalism, or else just plain emigration to the United States. Socialism was extremely popular among Jews for the reasons that I just explained above: in the internationalism, the communal and welfare aspects, and the opposition to market exploitation. In terms of integration and assimilation, now that the Jews were allowed to be equal in many countries, many Jews wanted to end the segregation of Jewish societies and live as any other of their countrymen. Some wanted to retain Jewish religion, but be German or French or Hungarian or British in every other respect, Hungarians and Englishmen of the Mosaic faith. This is more the case in Western Europe, where there was less segregation to begin with. In part, this was the project of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment that I talked about briefly last time. Others, especially in countries where anti-Semitism and discrimination were more of an obstacle to integration, they favored total assimilation. They thought that all the Jews should just mass convert to Christianity and abandon their Jewish identities entirely. And then there's Jewish nationalism, the idea that Jews should have their own autonomous political entity. And there's two main forms of that Jewish nationalism: national autonomism and Zionism. And the main difference is that the autonomists wanted Jewish self-government within the multinational empires of Europe. And while many of the Zionists also wanted Jewish self-government in Europe, they also wanted Jewish self-government in the historical land of Israel, inside of the Ottoman Empire. And self-government means different things to different Zionists, as we'll see in later episodes. Autonomism was popular among many minorities in European empires. The most popular form that Jewish autonomism took in Europe was called Bundism, or Jewish Labor Bundism, which also had a socialist orientation. And in this period, Zionism is very similar to autonomism. Zionism also wants Jews in the various empires to be treated like a nation within those empires, with national rights. But it also wants a special national territory in Eretz Israel, aka Palestine, the site of the original Jewish kingdoms of biblical times. And having that national territory is supposed to solve many of the problems of the Jews across the world. It's supposed to serve as a center of world Jewish culture and to set an example for Jewish communities around the world. It's supposed to fix the supposed deformities of Jewish culture, which were caused by the unusual class structure that I talked about earlier, with a tiny sliver of ultra-rich Jews and a giant mass of unemployed Jews hustling and selling rags and stealing and pimping and living off charity. And speaking of selling rags and hustling, if you've seen the Looney Tunes cartoon of the Three Little Pigs, there's a scene where the big bad wolf is dressed like a Jewish door-to-door salesman, and it's cut out of a lot of versions because it's kind of racist, but you can still find it on YouTube. And becoming quote-unquote normal is a huge preoccupation of many of the early Zionists, which we'll talk about in a bit. And you'll see, some of these guys are kind of embarrassed to be Jews, and they're blaming ghetto Jews' behavior for the discrimination against them. It's pretty similar to like Bill Cosby in the US telling young black men, "Stop saying the N-word and pull up your pants. It's disgraceful. And stop being a deadbeat dad. You're supposed to wear a rubber when you out, Camille." And with socialism being such an influence on East European Jews, many of the visions for this Jewish polity are social democratic or socialist visions in various ways that we'll see in future episodes. So according to the Zionists, the Jewish polity in Eretz Israel that they imagined had several important functions. It was supposed to serve as a place to go to for people facing persecution in their home countries. It was supposed to transform Jewish culture from something unnaturally distorted by being a subject nation in Europe and the Islamic world into something more normal. It was supposed to serve as a cultural center for Jews of the world, but also serve as an example to the rest of the world on how minorities should be treated, because the Jews would treat the minorities in their state the way that they wanted to be treated in other people's states. And it's important to point out that none of the big Zionist thinkers were expecting the bulk of the world's Jews to go to Palestine. They all expected that there would always be centers of Jewish people around the world, in Warsaw, in Amsterdam, in Baghdad, in Vilnius, in Salonika, which is now called Thessaloniki, in New York. And they expected that the existence of a Jewish state would make life better for those communities, as well as for people living in the actual Jewish state itself. And the Jewish state is supposed to do this by exerting its power on the global stage of nations, to prevent the persecution of Jews living in these other countries. Now, at first, Zionism wasn't particularly popular. Particularly in Western Europe, Jews who were already rather integrated into their societies tended to be horrified by Zionism, because they were finally on the threshold of being accepted into their national societies as Frenchmen or Englishmen or Hungarians, and then here comes this movement trying to argue that Jews aren't Frenchmen or Brits or Germans, but they're a whole other nationality, an Oriental nationality centered in the Middle East. To the integrationists and assimilationists, it was kind of like the Zionists were conforming to the paranoid fantasies of the nationalist anti-Semites. And religious Jews were also largely against it. The idea that secular Jews would go retake the Holy Land before God gave it back to us in Messianic times was seen by religious authorities, especially in Hasidic communities, as an offense to the religion and to God. And if you believe that a lot of religious interpretation has to do with material conditions and self-interests of the people doing the interpretation, it's often argued that these rabbinical authorities saw a secular Jewish state as a threat to their own authority. And in small Jewish shtetls across the Pale of Settlement, the authority of rabbis was declining in this era of secularism and equality before the law. But in the 19th century, their power was still considerable in some places, and they wanted to hold on to it. But there were two big series of events in the late 19th century that really put Zionism on the map and turned it from an intellectual idea into a popular mass movement among Jews. And those events are the Dreyfus Affair in the West and the assassination of Alexander II, Tsar of Russia, in the East. The Dreyfus Affair was a political scandal in France, where a French Jewish officer, Alfred Dreyfus, was convicted of treason and sentenced to life at hard labor on a penal colony in French Guyana in 1894. Dreyfus was a practicing Jew, but culturally he was a well-integrated Français, a Frenchman of the Mosaic faith. Now, 2 years into his conviction, investigators discovered that he was falsely accused, and that the real culprit was a French Catholic major. So the trial is reopened, and the Catholic major is now tried. But the army acquits the actually treasonous major and makes up new charges to keep Dreyfus in prison. And it becomes very apparent during the proceedings that the army is just making shit up against him because he's Jewish, and that they're acquitting the actual traitor because he's Catholic. And this causes a furor across France and across Europe, with people divided into Dreyfusards, who want him freed, and anti-Dreyfusards, who want them to throw away the key. It's basically between normal people with morals and racist pieces of shit. Eventually, this travesty is giving France such a bad reputation in the eyes of the world that he gets pardoned in 1899, after he's done 5 years of hard labor in Guyana. But he's not actually exonerated until 1906, almost 10 years after it was discovered that he was innocent. And the justice system was so slow to do actual justice because of anti-Semites in the judiciary, and also because even those who weren't big anti-Semites were still afraid of the anti-Semitic sentiments of people in various positions of power and of certain sectors of the public. So this huge scandal taught Jews across the world that even if you're totally integrated into your home society, and France was the OG society of secularism and equality before the law and emancipation for the Jews, even if you were a Frenchman like any other, but you happened to be Jewish, you were not going to be accepted by either the established institutions or a large chunk of the public, who will cheer for you to be sent away to hard labor for charges that they know that you didn't commit. Meanwhile, in the East, in Russia in 1881, 4 young members of the People's Will, a revolutionary socialist organization. They pull a Luigi on Tsar Alexander II and assassinate him. Basically, they're frustrated that he's holding back moves towards democracy in Russia. And while the West is moving towards more and more democracy, Russia is sticking firmly to its traditional medieval monarchism. Now, for all of his flaws, Alexander II had actually been more tolerant of Jews than his predecessors, and he had eliminated some special taxes on Jews and allowed Jews with a high school education to live outside the Pale of Settlement and to work in the civil service. So because of this, large numbers of Jews had quickly moved to the major cities of Russia. Before this, the only Jews who were allowed into the big cities were wealthy merchants and certain specialized artisans. But the sudden presence of Jewish competitors in the major cities stirred up renewed waves of anti-Semitism among the Russian middle and upper classes. So once Alexander II was assassinated, conspiracy theories that the Jews were behind it ran rampant, encouraged by the middle classes and by the dead Tsar's son, Alexander III, who hated Jews and blamed them for the death of his father. There were fake rumors that one of the conspirators was Jewish, which he wasn't. And then there were rumors that a Jewish member of the Socialist People's Will group had been involved in the assassination, though there's no evidence for that either. So Alexander III's coronation came with a wave of anti-Jewish riots, and the new Tsar quickly enacted a bunch of new anti-Jewish restrictions on where Jews could live, what professions they could practice, and where they could even rent property, banning Jews from living in rural areas, even inside of the Pale of Settlement. And then, more importantly, there was wave after wave of pogroms, where mobs would attack Jewish towns and settlements, and thousands of homes would be destroyed, and thousands of families and women and children were killed in gruesome ways, with most of the survivors reduced to permanent poverty, all with the passive or sometimes active approval or even participation of Russian officials and police. In reaction to this, huge numbers of Jews fled to the United States, which at the time had relatively lax immigration rules. 2 million over the next 40 years. A period where there were over 1,300 pogroms. So this series of events in Russia is what really gives life to Zionism as a mass movement. And it changed the minds of millions of people away from ideas of assimilation and integration towards nationalism. Historian Alan Doughty quotes as an example Chaim Chisin, a 16-year-old high school student in Moscow, where the Jewish community had been the most culturally Russianized. Quote, "Until these pogroms began, I myself had thrust aside my Jewish origins. I considered myself a devoted son of Russia. I lived and breathed a Russian life, and every new Russian scientific discovery, every new creation of Russian literature, every victory of Russian imperial power, everything Russian filled my heart with pride." Doughty continues, "By the time of the pogroms, a large part of the younger generation had pinned their hopes on integration into a liberalizing Russia. Now these hopes had collapsed. Not only had liberalization been reversed, but a tide of medieval violence had swept over the Jewish heartland. If becoming Russian was no longer an option, what remained? For many of those most disillusioned, the answer was a defiant reassertion of Jewish identity, the very identity that they had sought to escape or minimize. Chisin expressed the thought common to many. Yes, whether I wish it or not, I am a Jew. We have in common a great past in which we served the world and gave it basic ethics." Unquote. So Chisin, like many others of his generation, turns to Zionism as the solution to the problems of the Jews of Russia and of the world. And we'll see next time that Chisin becomes one of the first Zionists to go and settle in Palestine, and we'll see what his reactions are to life there and to the direction that the Zionist movement takes. Before we look at Zionism and see what the leading Zionist thinkers and organizers were thinking and doing and writing, and before we reveal the first little secret of the Israel-Palestine conflict, let's talk briefly about colonialism. In pro-Palestine versions of history, Zionism is described as pure and simple colonialism, and that description is meant to delegitimize it from the get-go, to make the whole idea immoral at its heart. It's not just what Israel did or does that's bad, but it's rather the whole idea of Zionism that's supposed to be bad and illegitimate. Not in its execution, but from its inception. Israel can't do anything right because the whole concept of it is evil from the start. And to people on the pro-Israel side, the idea that Zionism is colonialism is just a bad faith lie made to delegitimize an entirely morally just enterprise. So while we're looking at what the various Zionist thinkers were envisioning, and what the various Zionist factions were doing when they started moving to Palestine, we want to also be thinking and asking ourselves, is this colonialism? But what is colonialism? First of all, the most important thing about colonialism is that it's supposed to be bad. It's like rape. There's no benevolent rape versus bad rape. By nature, it's an abusive violation of someone's freedom and integrity. According to the pro-Israel narrative, the Zionists wanted to immigrate peacefully to Palestine and to build institutions and build communities there until they would eventually become a majority of the population, at which point they could make that into a sovereign territory by democratic means. Meanwhile, the Arab minority of this new country wouldn't be kicked out or expelled, they would just become a minority because the number of Jews would increase, and the Arabs would be treated as equal citizens with full rights in the Jewish majority state. Now, we'll see later whether this happened or not, but regardless, what I just described is not colonialism. It involves establishing colonies, i.e. settlements. It involves taking over a country that was already inhabited by other people, but there's nothing inherently wrong happening in this scenario. You're not pushing anyone out, you're not taking away anyone's rights, you're not doing any ethnic cleansing, you're not hurting anyone, it's just demographic change over time. If the Uyghurs in China started immigrating to Vermont over the course of 70 years, and then they eventually become the majority, and they declare a Uyghur homeland there, and white Vermonters can still live there as full citizens, the white people in Vermont might not want that, but it's not evil or violent, right? Mouin Rabbani, in that crazy 5-hour debate on the Lex Friedman podcast, said to Destiny at one point that no one's going to want another people coming to town and taking over. And that's true. And they might try to pass laws to prevent that. But in our analogy, if the Vermonters took up arms to fight the Uyghurs, we wouldn't call that resistance to colonialism or freedom fighters. We would call that racism and race riots and anti-immigrant violence. Demographics in neighborhoods change over time. My neighborhood used to be a working-class Jewish neighborhood, and then it became a Greek neighborhood, and then it became an artist hipster neighborhood, and now it's turning into a Hasidic Jewish neighborhood. That's not colonialism. People have referendums and establish new nations. That's not colonialism. What makes immigration into colonialism is when the immigrants are not just seeking to immigrate there and settle peacefully. It's colonialism when the project involves doing harm to the people who are already there, either by expelling them or monopolizing resources and blocking them off from the existing population, or by turning the population into a labor force for the profit of the new immigrants who are going to be the bosses and take all the profits. And this can involve making the original inhabitants into second-class citizens with less rights, or nominally equal citizens, but pushed into economic subservience and exploitation via the vastly unequal bargaining power of the existing population versus the new state-backed immigrant population. So colonialism isn't just peaceful immigration. It's immigration as a means of domination and or exploitation and or stealing resources from weaker people by stronger people. In terms of academic definitions, you usually have two models of colonialism. You have the classic colonialism, aka exploitation colonialism model, or you have the pure colonialism, aka settler colonialism model. In the exploitation model, one country sends out people to another land to establish colonies on that land. And colonies just mean settlements. But what makes it colonialism instead of just colonies or immigration is that they're establishing these colonies there in order to gain control over that territory with the ultimate goal of extracting resources, natural resources, and the labor of the local population for the benefit of the mother country and for the benefit of the foreign colonists. Usually in this model, the colonists are not seeking to become the majority of the population. They just want to control the territory and its resources, including the population as a labor force. This is what France was doing in Algeria and many other places around the world. They set up agricultural plantations and factories owned by French colonists, and then used Algerians as low-wage employees. And France's campaign to conquer Algeria was a horrid mass murder that killed between 1/6 and 1/3 of the entire population of that country. Eventually, they gave some wealthier Algerians, and also Jews in general, French citizenship rights. But the majority of the population was disenfranchised and served as a labor pool for the benefit of French industry. Settler colonialism is when one country sends out people to settle another territory and exploit it for the benefit of the mother country, but instead of becoming a dominant minority, exploiting the majority, the settlers seek to push out the native population by force and take over their land completely. It's a bit like a more modern version of the ancient types of tribal warfare that you had all through the Neolithic era. From ancient Hebrews to Vikings to Zulus, one tribe fights off another tribe and takes their land and kills all the men and keeps the women and children, or kills all the men, women, and children. Except that in colonialism, the implication is that it's a more powerful civilization taking over a less powerful tribal or subsistence society, or a less developed civilization. Canada, the United States, and Australia were built on this model. And these types of colonies will often declare independence from the mother country at a certain point when their populations are big enough and wealthy enough, and when they no longer need the support of the mother country to maintain their dominance. Exploitation colonies, on the other hand, usually need the mother country's military and economic support for longer or forever because the colonists are a minority ruling over a large majority, and their entire economy is oriented around shoveling resources into the mother country, as opposed to the settler colonies whose economies are in part geared towards exporting to the mother country, but they're also geared towards supporting themselves. Now, pro-Palestine historians and activists argue that Zionism is settler colonialism. The early Zionists planned to come in and take over Palestine, and this project inherently required ethnic cleansing, as it could not have been achieved by peaceful means. People often point to the fact that many leading Zionists explicitly referred to what they were doing as colonizing, and they called many of their institutions colonial this and colonial that, like the Jewish Colonization Association, Jewish Colonial Trust, Jewish Colonization Department, and we'll talk about these later. And these historians will say that the Zionists were operating on racist 19th century assumptions, where colonialism was seen as legitimate and not as inherently evil as it is today. And thus the early Zionists were proud to label themselves as colonizers. But then Israel supporters will laugh at this and point out that colonizing just means establishing settlements, and that there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. According to these historians, yes, the Jews were colonizing, but they were colonizing as in going to establish communities and settlements. But that doesn't make it colonialism. There was no plan to exploit anyone or push anyone out or exterminate anyone. And they also point out that there was no home country sending anyone there for exploitation purposes. Colonialism, as I just described it, is always in the service of imperialism. Imperialism means empire politics, and in practical terms, what it means is that a more powerful country is forcing a less powerful country to bend to its will or service its interests. Like a powerful country will impose a shitty trade deal on a less powerful country because it benefits the rich country, even though it harms the poor country. And Zionism initially emerged independently of service to any empire or home country. For example, when the first Zionists immigrated to Palestine, they did so illegally, meaning that you weren't actually allowed to leave the Russian Empire without special permission, which the Russian government did not give them. And the Zionists weren't going to send resources from Palestine back to Russia. They were expecting to leave Russia and to sever their ties to it. So where's the colonialism? And then the pro-Palestine guys will be like, yes, you were planning to do ethnic cleansing. Look at the Nakba in 1948. And the Zionists will be like, nuh-uh, we only ended up doing the ethnic cleansing in self-defense because you started a war in order to ethnic cleanse us. And if we didn't do it to you first, you were going to do it to us. Yuh-huh, nuh-uh, yuh-huh. Now, the more serious critics of Israel who use the settler colonial model, like Rashid Khalidi, acknowledge that Zionism was not exactly the same as other settler colonial projects because there was no mother country that was sending the Jews to Palestine. They were coming from all different countries. And these countries like Russia, Poland, Lithuania, and later Morocco, Iraq, and Yemen, they had no interest in the establishment of a Jewish state. And the Zionists certainly had no intention of funneling the resources of Palestine back to those countries. But, according to Khalidi, it's still settler colonialism because even without a mother country, or a metropole in academic parlance, the goal was to establish a state specifically for Jews, which means it's dominated by Jews, which inherently required pushing Arabs out of the territory of that state to create the Jewish majority. And then even if the Zionists didn't have a mother country, they eventually did have the British Empire as a sponsor country. And it was the British Empire that made their project possible against the will of the majority Arabs. And the British wanted a Jewish state there in order to serve British interests. So at the end of the day, Zionism is just a somewhat unusual form of colonialism. The fundamental evil at the heart of it is the same. And then the supporters of Israel, like the Israel Times journalist Haviv Rettig Gur, will respond, well then duh, it's not colonialism if it doesn't fit the main criteria of colonialism, and if creating a Jewish state did not require ethnic cleansing, then where's the colonialism? Yuh-huh, no-uh, yuh-huh. At the end of the day, the argument isn't as much about colonialism, but it's about whether or not the Zionists were inherently doing something bad or not. If they were doing something bad, then Arab violence against Zionism falls under the umbrella of resistance and legitimate self-defense, even if it sometimes crosses the line. And if the Zionists weren't doing something bad, then Arab violence against the Zionist settlers falls under the umbrella of racism and terrorism. And Jewish violence is self-defense, even if it crosses the line sometimes. Ultimately, the real questions we want to answer are not about whether Zionism is colonialism or not. We want to answer the question of, is Zionism bad or not? And whether or not Arab violence and Zionist violence are in the spirit of self-defense or else aggression for the purposes of racist domination, and whether it's colonialism or not is kind of a side issue. So if you watch this series and then you decide that Zionism is colonialism or Zionism is not colonialism, then great. But whatever you decide, I want you to make those conclusions on your own by seeing what happened, rather than just telling you what to think from the get-go so that all the information you learn falls into this pre-made chicken McNuggets mold set out for you in advance. In this conflict, words like terrorism and colonialism are used to bypass any thought or analysis. And it's a conflict that needs a lot more thought and analysis and less chicken McNuggets. And speaking of pre-made chicken McNuggets mold categories, normally in American academia, you want to pre-feed your conclusions and perspectives to your audience right at the beginning of the book or your article, so that every sentence that the audience reads after that just nicely fits into the perspective that you've already laid out for them. That way they never have to stop and think too much about anything. They can just read and absorb the information quickly and efficiently, like Jell-O. It's like the opposite of a joke. You do the punchline first, and then you tell the story, so that nobody's ever confused. The academia way is very good for political speeches, or if you're giving testimony in court, when the most important thing is that the audience comes to the conclusion that you want them to come to, and you want them to absorb the information with as little confusion or reflection as possible. And the punchline first method is also a good thing when you're trying to be respectful to your audience's time, like when they're academics who have to consume giant piles of text every day and they don't have time to think or to take a shit. And the punchline first method is also great if you're trying to fatten pigs to make bacon out of them. But I'm trying to do the opposite, to get you to put aside your preconceived notions so that you come to conclusions on your own. Given that this is such a hot topic, where everyone's brains are wired shut in advance, if I give my conclusions at the beginning, everyone's heads will explode unless they already agree with me, and no one will pay any attention to anything I say after that. And then they will just be arguing with me in their heads the whole time in order to hold on to their stupid McDonald's Chicken McNuggets narratives that they've been raised with since childhood, and they won't be absorbing the actual information. So I'm going to make my conclusions very clear, but only at the end of the series, once you have all the information that I have, when you can see why I think what I think, and you can agree or disagree with me, but without your head exploding right at the beginning. Before we continue, I have another word to say about colonialism. I find that people get caught up in these ideas, colonialism, capitalism, neoliberalism, patriarchy, and then they start to miss what the actual problem is. People who are fixated on capitalism just see everything as the fault of capitalism. And you'll see a lot of articles about how racism is capitalism, and patriarchy is capitalism, and colonialism is capitalism. Or else, for people who are fixated on colonialism, you'll have articles about how gentrification is colonialism, mass incarceration is colonialism, capitalism is colonialism, patriarchy is colonialism. Or people who are obsessed with patriarchy will write about how capitalism is patriarchy, and environmental destruction is patriarchy, and colonialism is patriarchy. And they're all making interesting connections while they're missing the bigger picture. The bad things about capitalism or colonialism or patriarchy or feudalism or slavery aren't this or that slur word music genre label. What's bad about all these things is that they involve situations where people with power are getting away with screwing over people with less power. That is the fundamental problem of human politics and human conflicts. Power imbalances. When humans don't have to suffer the consequences or even see the consequences of our actions, we will exploit people or cause them huge amounts of damage and harm or even mass death in pursuit of our own interests. And that's kind of the central philosophy of this show. When some people have more power than others, and when this power imbalance is on a permanent basis or long-term institutionalized basis, when the people with power are unaccountable to the people with less power, the people with power will use that power to their advantage, regardless of the effects that it has on the people with less power. They'll exploit them, neglect them, let them starve and die, or mass murder them. That's almost all of the problems in the world right there outside of natural disasters. And it's kind of obvious, But you don't see this in political discourse. It's like forgotten in all of this jumble of stupid words. And if you just focus on the buzzwords, colonialism, capitalism, neoliberalism, imperialism, patriarchy, instead of on the fundamental power imbalances that make those things bad, you can easily be manipulated and tricked into thinking that the solution to the problems is replacing the bad buzzword, capitalism or colonialism, with a good buzzword like socialism or feminism or progressivism or anti-colonialism, whatever buzzwords you're attracted to, and symbols and flags. Now, if the type of socialism or feminism or progressivism or anti-colonial liberation that you're supporting is actually focused on equalizing power, then that's great. That's what you need to solve the problems. But a lot of the times, people are using the same words, socialism, feminism, anti-colonial liberation, to just mean a system where a different group of people has unaccountable idiotic power than the existing group. And what that means is that you'll inevitably just end up with a new class of oppressors. So people end up putting all of this effort and energy into supporting awful movements. Capitalism is bad, so that Stalin must be good. Or imperialism is bad, so Bashar al-Assad must be good. But newsflash, if you have a situation where foreign white people are exploiting local brown people, and you replace that with a new dictatorship where you now have a small faction of local brown people oppressing the majority of the other brown people, that's not progress. Like, sometimes it can be progress if the new dictators are better than the old ones, but it's certainly not liberation, and sometimes it's even worse. So, when you watch these videos, or when you live your daily life, focus more on the fundamental structures of who has and doesn't have power versus this or that buzzword of the day. Anyone can call themselves a socialist or Democrat or liberal or conservative or Christian or feminist, and you can label anyone you want, a colonialist or terrorist or racist or woke or whatever it is. But never mind these stupid labels. Look at what they're actually doing. So like I said earlier, in the late 1800s, the idea of Zionism, the creation of a Jewish polity in the biblical land of Israel, this wasn't just the idea of a refuge for Jews. It was supposed to be a solution to the problems that Jews faced all around the world. And one of those problems is that wherever you find Jews in the world, they're a minority. And minorities are at the mercy of the majority, and at the mercy of the rulers of the land. In North Africa, or al-Andalus, you had good treatment and a golden age for Jews under one set of kings, and then a few generations later, you have repressions and persecutions. In Poland and Lithuania, you had flourishing Jewish communities for centuries, and then when the Russians take over, all of a sudden you have waves of pogroms and poverty and misery. The Jewish state is supposed to solve this problem in two ways. One, by being a place where Jews can flee, but also by being a force on the international stage that can push back against these persecutions. If the Russians persecute the Jews, and there's no Jewish state, some intellectuals might protest around the world, but no government will care enough about this persecuted minority that lives in a different country to take any action against big, powerful Russia. Now you might be wondering, what could a tiny state like modern Israel do to influence a huge empire like Russia, one way or the other? It wouldn't be economically powerful enough to make a difference, it wouldn't be militarily powerful enough to make a difference, and it wouldn't be politically important enough to make a difference. And the answer to that question is, what could they do? Not much. And this is where one of the little buried secrets of the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict comes in. And it's the least important secret in my opinion, but it's still pretty interesting. And that secret is that until the late 1930s, meaning almost 60 years after Zionist immigration to Palestine begins, most Zionist thinkers were not imagining the Jewish state as an independent Jewish state. Until the late 1930s, most leading Zionists were imagining the Jewish state in their public writings and private correspondence and in their diaries as a state in the sense of Nebraska. They were imagining it as a province of the Ottoman Empire, and later as an autonomous state within an Arab federation of states, and later as a dominion of the British Empire, and then penultimately as a single state, but not as an ethno-national state, but rather as a small multinational state. The idea of Israel as a unified democratic state, identified with its Jewish majority, only became a mainstream political position in Zionism after the 1937 Peel Partition Plan that we'll talk about later in a future episode. When you read the literature and speeches and private correspondences of the time, you can see this everywhere. But historians on both pro-Israel and pro-Palestine sides sort of interpret all this as some kind of ruse on behalf of Zionist leaders, where the leaders wanted to admit only less ambitious aspirations in public for political reasons, but their secret ultimate aim was always the ethnic nation state, like what Israel is today. But in 2019, a scholar named Dmitry Shumsky published a book specifically about this, where he goes through all the writings of the major Zionist thinkers and their private correspondences to show that no, they actually meant this. From Herzl to Jabotinsky to Ben-Gurion to Ahad Ha'am and Leon Pinsker, all of whom we'll eventually talk about, the big leading Zionist thinkers always pictured the Jewish state as part of a greater entity, until the late 1930s. To understand this, you need to keep in mind that this was the age of empires. Most of the states that we know of in Europe today were at the time of early Zionism either parts of larger empires, like the Russian Empire or the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the Ottoman Empire, or if they weren't part of a multinational empire, they were strong military powers leading their own large colonial empires, like the British Empire or France or Belgium and Germany. To most people, a small independent state was a foolish idea, as it would just end up being a pawn of one or another of the great powers. So not many people, at least not many educated intellectual types who were like leading these movements, were interested in this vision for a Jewish state. And we'll see later that when Arab nationalism starts to emerge, the Arabs of Palestine initially opposed the idea of an independent Palestinian state, and they wanted Palestine to be part of Syria for exactly the same reasons that the Jews were looking to be part of a larger federation of states, or a larger empire. A tiny independent Israel couldn't do much against Russia persecuting the Jews, but the Ottoman Empire, which is where Palestine and the biblical land of Israel was situated, and which was one of the great empires of the world, and which bordered the Russian Empire where most of the Zionists were, the Ottoman Empire could intervene against Russia on behalf of one of its constituent nationalities. Similarly, when the Czech minority in Germany was being abused, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where most of the Czechs were, would step in on behalf of one of their peoples. And in the next episode, when we focus on Palestine and the structure and politics of the Ottoman Empire, we'll see how the idea of being part of the Ottoman Empire in particular, as opposed to one of the other empires, was actually very attractive to the Zionists, beyond the idea of Eretz Israel and the historical location of the Jewish kingdoms in the Torah. Ultimately, the Zionists hoped that the Jewish state would be part of a multinational federation, which wasn't dominated by some other power like the Ottomans or Austro-Hungarians, but rather that was democratic, something in between the US and the EU. So, the theory of many nationalists, including many of the Zionists, was to campaign to turn the empires, Russia, Austria, Hungary, and the Ottomans, into democratic federations of different nationality states. And in each state, each nationality would run their own affairs, and members of minorities would be protected from being oppressed by the majorities in those states, those provinces, because their nation-state would also be part of the same multinational empire. And this idea of nationalists wanting to be part of bigger federations isn't unique to Zionism. It was actually typical of many of the national movements inside of the big empires. And you can see similar ideas from the Croatian, Romanian, Ukrainian, and Czech nationalists, for example. And we'll also see something sort of similar from the Arabs in the Ottoman Empire in a few decades. And Zionists would cite a modified democratic Austro-Hungarian Empire as an example of what they wanted. And they'd also cite the structure of the United States of America. Now, I'm really jumping ahead with some of this, because when we end this episode, we're just going to end at the point when Zionists go to Palestine, and all of these theories of multinational Zionism sort of get elaborated over the course of many decades. But you'll see this idea already when we talk about Leon Pinsker's auto-emancipation pamphlet from 1882, which inspired many people to actually move to Palestine for Zionist reasons. But before I read from Auto-Emancipation, I want to give a little mini-history of Zionism that happened before Auto-Emancipation. The idea of creating a Jewish polity in the Ottoman Empire wasn't entirely new. In the 1560s, a powerful Jewish Ottoman diplomat, who had originally fled there from Portugal, had permission from the Sultan to create a Jewish city-state in the city of Tiberias and the surrounding areas. The idea was to both help Jews flee Europe, but also to create a textile industry. But his plan there ultimately failed. The Auto-Emancipation pamphlet is written in 1882, and that's also when you get the first wave of Zionist immigration to Palestine. But you already have people thinking about having large numbers of Jews settle in Palestine, or else even create a state there, since the 1830s. Now, in one sense, Zionism is actually built into the Jewish religion. A lot of Jews on the left hate to hear this, But a lot of the Old Testament is about the Jews being given the land, and then making their kingdom there, and then being exiled to Babylon, and then coming back in the 6th century BC to rebuild a temple, and so many of the practices and commandments of the Torah are centered around the temple in Jerusalem. So throughout Jewish history, since the Great Exiles, you have a lot of reference to the days when the Jews will come back to Israel and rebuild the temple and live life as they were meant to do. But for 1800 years or so, until the 1830s, that sort of Zionism is passive and messianic. It's a dream that will happen in the distant future or in end times. In general, Jews kept their heads down, and the return to Israel stayed in their prayers. But in 1831, the Ottomans invited Muhammad Ali, aka Mehmet Ali, the governor of the Ottoman province of Egypt, to send his forces into Greece and the Levant. And they invite him to do this in order to put down rebellion and unrest that was happening there at the time. Ali obliges, but then he goes rogue, and he basically attempts to occupy these territories on a permanent basis for himself. And he stays in Palestine until 1840. And Ali was a big modernizer, and he wanted to reinvigorate the region and the empire as a whole. And he tried and failed to take over the whole Ottoman Empire. And as part of Ali's reforms, conditions for Jews and Christians improved. And European consuls were allowed to visit and then stay in Palestine for the first time since the Crusades, starting with the British consulate, which opened in Jerusalem in 1839. And then, after Ali was forced out of the Levant in 1840 by the Ottomans with help from the great European powers, the Ottomans rewarded the Europeans by letting them all open consulates in Jerusalem. And so a new era was born in Palestine. Suddenly, for the first time, basically in 1800 years, you have a regime that's friendly to Europeans coming to purchase land and settle in Palestine. Very quickly, you start to get more and more Jewish immigration there. And you also get interest by various Jewish organizations and ultra-wealthy Jewish financier family philanthropists like Sir Moses Montefiore, going down there to look at buying land there for Jews to farm, or else opening schools for all the impoverished Jews there to learn trades or agriculture. And as part of this wave of renewed interest in moving to Palestine, Moses Montefiore proposes to Muhammad Ali that he'll open up a bunch of banks in Beirut and Jaffa and Jerusalem and Cairo, which Ali was very enthusiastic about. And Montefiore thought that this would make Ali favorable to the idea of giving Montefiore a huge 50-year land grant where he could establish up to 200 Jewish villages, though this never happened in the end. Meanwhile, in Europe, Zionist ideas of establishing a Jewish state started popping up almost immediately. Today, Zionism is associated with secular Jews. But the first active Zionists who made efforts to establish a Jewish state were religious Jews. You have various rabbis and religious people in different parts of Eastern and Western Europe coming up with similar ideas at the same time about how Jews should prepare to go back to Palestine and farm and reestablish a Jewish state there. And they were influenced by various European nationalist contemporaries in Greece, Italy, Poland, and Hungary. The most well-known of these was Rabbi Zvi Hirsch Kalischer from Poland. Already in the 1830s, he tried to convince Amschel Rothschild and then Sir Moses Montefiore that I just mentioned, both ultra-wealthy Jews from mega-finance families. He tried to convince them of various schemes to buy Jerusalem from Muhammad Ali, or to pressure the colonial powers to give Israel to the Jews. Rothschild ignores him, but he basically converts Montefiore to the idea of Jews returning to Israel, which is one of the reasons he was going there to make these proposals to Muhammad Ali. One of these early Zionists, Rabbi Friedland, writes to Napoleon III to see if he can use diplomatic channels to convince the Ottoman Sultan to let the Jews return to Israel in large numbers. And Napoleon actually replies to him, saying that the diplomatic conditions weren't right for that at this moment, but that he'd keep it in mind for the future. Some of these early Zionists wanted to reestablish a religious Jewish state there and rebuild the temple. Others just wanted a return of large numbers of Jews there without a specific goal in terms of a state. And when it comes to these rabbis like Kalischer, when I say Jewish state, they actually did mean an independent Jewish state, unlike the major Zionist thinkers that I'll be talking about in the future, who were thinking of a province or a state in the sense of a province or a subpolity. And Kalischer and these other rabbis and religious Zionists ran around Europe and went back and forth to Palestine, forming different societies to try to convince the general Jewish public to get behind these ideas. Kalischer even held a sort of Zionist Congress of Jews, mostly rabbis, from around Europe in 1860. Although religious Jews in Israel today see Kalischer as one of the founders of religious Zionism, these guys really didn't get very far. In 1862, Kalischer wrote the first Zionist pamphlet, called Seeking Zion, where he expounded his ideas and the religious and practical justifications for them. And it was received with enthusiasm in the Jewish villages of Europe, where people were more religious. And Seeking Zion clubs formed all over Europe, from London to small towns in Poland. Kalischer got letters from around the world, from Jews asking if they could go and farm in Eretz Israel. But this didn't last very long because of the vehement rejection of these ideas by the vast majority of Jewish religious authorities in Europe, and also in Palestine itself. Within a short time, the central Seeking Zion Association fell apart, as did most of the local clubs, and many of Kalischer's initial backers retracted their support, and that was that. In the secular Jewish world, Zionist ideas fell flat from the get-go. The same year as Kalischer's book, in 1862, Moses Hess, a socialist and friend and mentor to Karl Marx, wrote a book advocating for a Jewish state from a secular socialist perspective. And he reprinted Kalischer's Seeking Zion pamphlet inside his book, called From Rome to Jerusalem. But this book got a cold reaction, and it didn't generate any activism. While more and more Jews came to Palestine over the next decades in search of newly available economic opportunities there, and while many people believed that Jews should return to the land and become farmers, the idea of establishing a Jewish state there simply did not catch on among the Jewish masses at this point. Zionism, in the sense of a return to the land, was growing and becoming very popular, and Jewish immigration to Palestine was definitely happening. But Zionism in the sense of establishing a state did not yet resonate beyond a limited, mostly religious audience. Among the leading intellectuals of the Jewish Enlightenment, whose leading figure was Moses Mendelssohn, it was the city of Berlin, which was a world center of intellectual ideas and economic and political progress and power. That was the new Zion for them, not backwards rural Palestine. But then, starting in 1878, you have a succession of events that changes everything. I mentioned the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881. But before that, in 1878, Romania, or most of it anyways, gets its independence from the Ottoman Empire after siding with Russia in the Russian-Turkish War of 1877 and 88. Life had never been great for Jews in Romania in the 19th century, but once Romania had gained its independence, Romanian nationalism was just brutal towards the Jews. The Romanians didn't even want to give Jews citizenship, never mind equal rights. And the Jews of Romania at that point were like, we're better off under the Ottomans. We need to get the hell out of here. And by 1881, they hold a Zionist Congress in Europe. It's sort of the first ever Zionist Congress, except not exactly, because the Rabbi Zionists had a sort of Congress in 1860. Anyhow, in this Zionist Congress, they have 50 or so delegates. But these delegates represent members that comprise about 1/3 of all the Jews in Romania at that time. So this was truly a mass movement. And the idea that they come up with at this Congress is that local organizations will buy plots of agricultural land in Palestine and send Jews to go farm there. And eventually, there'll be enough Jews there that the Ottoman Empire will eventually grant them a Jewish province. And the same year as the Congress in Romania, you get the assassination of Tsar Alexander in Russia, along with the waves and waves of pogroms and anti-Jewish laws there. So in response to all this, many Jews in Russia start joining organizations established for the purpose of getting Jews out of Russia and into the United States. Something like 1.5 million Jews end up leaving the Russian Empire and settling in the United States over the next 40 years. But a much smaller number of Jews start joining Lovers of Zion clubs all around Russia, inspired by the Romanians and also by Leo Pinsker's Autonomism pamphlet, which comes out in 1882. So now let's get into this pamphlet, Autonomism by Leon Pinsker. Autonomism is often cited as the first important Zionist text, in that it really captured the thinking and feeling of many Jews at this time, but also in that it literally inspired much of the first wave of Zionist immigration to Palestine. And this pamphlet is from 1882, 1 year after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II that set off the pogroms that we talked about. Leon Pinsker was a doctor who grew up in a small town in Poland, and then he studied to be a lawyer in Odessa in the Ukraine. And both Poland and Ukraine were part of the Russian Empire at that time. But then when Russia imposed new restrictions on occupations for Jews while he was doing his studies, Pinsker could no longer become a lawyer, and he became a physician instead. For much of his life, Pinsker thought that the solution to the problem of the Jews was for the Jews to become emancipated and to get equal rights with the citizens of the nations of Europe. But as anti-Jewish violence and pogroms increased in the 1870s, And then, after he visited some of the countries of Western Europe, where Jews did have equal rights before the law, Pinsker comes back to Odessa, convinced that emancipation isn't going to solve anything. He can see that the equality of Jews in the West was just a dead letter. The Jews of Europe would never be accepted by their home countries unless and until they had their own national territory. And his reasoning is quite interesting, as we'll see. Auto-emancipation starts off with a quote from the 1st century BC and CE, Jewish scholar Hillel, who lived in ancient Babylon and Jerusalem. Quote, "If I do not help myself, who will help me? And if not now, when?" Unquote. And Pinsker starts off by talking about the miserable and unequal situation of Jews around the world, and how wherever they are, they're oppressed and hated by the people among whom they live. According to Pinsker, quote, "The essence of the problem as we see it consists in the fact that, in the midst of the nations among whom the Jews reside, they form a heterogeneous element which cannot be assimilated, which cannot be readily digested by any nation." Unquote. And he tells us that while discrimination between people and hostility between ethnic groups might always exist, that there's a certain equality in relationships between nations who interact via international law and treaties that mitigates this hostility, and which forces there to be a certain tolerance and dignity between peoples. And the subtext of this, I think, is that when both sides have armies, they can't just bully each other willy-nilly. Except that when it comes to the Jews can't have that relative equality because Jews are not a nation and have no power to force anyone to treat them properly. Quote, "They lack most of the attributes which are the hallmarks of a nation. They lack that characteristic national life which is inconceivable without a common language, common customs, and a common land. The Jewish people have no fatherland of their own, though many motherlands. They have no rallying point, no center of gravity, no government of their own, no accredited representatives. They are everywhere in evidence and nowhere at home. The nations never have to deal with a Jewish nation, but always with mere Jews." Unquote. And I find this really interesting that motherland is where you were born, but a fatherland is where you have a government and an army. Motherland is the vagina earth, and fatherland is the military penis. Then he tells us that once their fatherland was destroyed, the Jews become like ghosts, floating around the world, frightening all the other people from the other nations where they live. And he doesn't even blame the non-Jews for being afraid, because it's only natural to be afraid of ghosts. Quote, "Among the living nations of the earth, the Jews occupy the position of a nation long since dead. With the loss of their fatherland, the Jewish people lost their independence and fell into a decay which is not compatible with the existence of an integral living organism. After the Jewish people had given up their existence as an actual state, the world saw in this people the uncanny form of one of the dead walking among the living. This ghost-like apparition of a people without unity or organization, without land or other bond of union, no longer alive and yet moving about among the living. This strange form, hardly paralleled in history, unlike anything that preceded or followed it, could not fail to make a strange peculiar impression upon the imagination of the peoples. And if the fear of ghosts is something innate, fear of the Jewish ghost has been handed down and strengthened for generations and centuries. It led to a prejudice which in its turn, in connection with other circumstances, opened the way for Judeophobia. Along with a number of other unconscious and superstitious ideas, instincts, and idiosyncrasies, Judeophobia also has become fully naturalized among all the peoples of the earth with whom the Jews have had intercourse. It is the fear of ghosts, thanks to which the whole Jewish nation is wont to be held responsible for the real or supposed sins of its individual members, and to be slandered in so many ways, to be buffeted about so shamefully. The Jews are said to have crucified Jesus, to have drunk Christian blood, to have poisoned wells, to have taken usury, to have exploited the peasant, and so forth. These and 1,000 other charges against an entire people were proved groundless. We find these accusations contradicted by the fact that the Jews get along fairly well in close intercourse with their non-Jewish neighbors." Unquote. So he thinks people get along well with Jews when they meet them on a day-to-day level. But in the abstract, as a people, they're like a boogeyman that's blamed for every evil in the world. Quote, "For the living, the Jew is a dead man. For the natives, an alien and a vagrant. For the property holders, a beggar. For the poor, an exploiter and a millionaire. For the patriots, a man without a country. for all classes a hated rival." Unquote. He goes on to claim that every nation in the world hates the Jews, but whether that hatred is expressed through violent attacks in some countries, or superficial tolerance like in the Western countries, or condescending protection like in the Ottoman Empire, it's all just different forms of discrimination and oppression. Quote, "No matter how much the nations are at variance in their relations with one another, no matter how different in their instincts and endeavors, they join hands in their hatred of the Jews. On this single point they are all agreed. The extent and the manner in which this antipathy is manifested depends, of course, on the cultural status of each people. The antipathy as such, however, exists everywhere and at all times, no matter whether it appears in the form of deeds of violence, as envious jealousy, or under the mask of tolerance and protection. To be plundered as a Jew, or to be protected as a Jew, is equally humiliating, equally painful to the self-respect of the Jews." Unquote. Hatred of Jews is actually genetic to the human race, according to Pinsker, so there's no point in fighting it. And there are all sorts of parallels here to the Afro-pessimist writers we have in the US in recent times, who think that racism against blacks is fundamental to America and can never disappear. Except Pinsker seems to think that it's just normal for people to hate Jews because of the degraded state of their existence. Quote, "Having analyzed Judeophobia as a hereditary form of demonopathy, particular to the human race, we must draw the important conclusion that we must give up contending against these hostile impulses, just as we give up contending against every other intended predisposition." Unquote. And he tells us that everyone discriminates against foreigners, but that it goes beyond mere discrimination against foreigners when it comes to the Jews, because the Jews are neither foreigners nor natives, they're just eternal outsiders. Quote, "No people, generally speaking, has any predilection for foreigners. This fact has its ethnological basis and cannot be brought as a reproach against any people. The foreigner has no need to be or seem to be a patriot. But as for the Jew, not only is he not native in his own home country, but he is also not a foreigner. He is, in very truth, the stranger par excellence, of whom the only thing known is that he has no home. The foreigner claims hospitality, which he can repay in the same coin. The Jew can make no such return. He can make no claim to hospitality. He is not a guest, much less a welcome guest. He is more like a beggar. And what beggar is welcome?" Unquote. And by hospitality, he means that, for example, if a citizen of France goes to live in England, England will treat him well because they want reciprocity from France when English people go to live there. But the Jews can't get hospitality because they have no nation with which to offer it to others. Interestingly, while he describes Jews as ghosts and strangers, he also sees Jews as indigenous to Russia and Poland and Ukraine and Romania, etc. In a letter 2 years later, Pinsker says, quote, "We are nevertheless the ancient sons of the Russian land. On her soil our forefathers were raised and died. On this soil Russia found us. We consider ourselves indigenous inhabitants of the Russian state, to which we have always been devoted as to our homeland. In equal measure to all others, we think of ourselves as subjects of the Tsar of Russia, in whom we place all our hopes, for whom we are prepared to lay down our lives and our property. No one can take from us this right, however much they try to contest it." Unquote. So the Zionists don't want to abandon their local identities, but they want a national identity as well in order to put them on equal status. Pinsker compares Jews to Black Americans and women who need equal rights. Except, according to him, the Jews have it worse because the Jews are an advanced civilization and produce great men, unlike women and black people. And then he tells us that, quote, "In the great majority of cases, the Jew is treated as a stepchild, as a Cinderella. In the most favorable cases, he is regarded as an adopted child whose rights may be questioned. Never is he considered a legitimate child of the fatherland." Unquote. And he talks about what a disappointment legal emancipation had been in the West. And this also has a lot of parallels to Black Americans, who will say, we had legal equality in the 1950s, but 60 years later, we're still disproportionately poor and discriminated against and looked down on in various ways. And Pinsker tells us that the Western countries didn't want to emancipate their Jews, but that they had to, in order not to look like hypocrites given their supposedly liberal secular values. Without Jews having a host nation that can offer hospitality, legal equality is not true equality. It's like a gift of charity bestowed by superiors. Quote, "The legal emancipation of the Jews is the culminating achievement of our century. But legal emancipation is not social emancipation. And with the proclamation of the former, the Jews are still far from being emancipated from their exceptional social position. The emancipation of Jews is required as a postulate of logic, of law, and of enlightened national interest, but it can never be a spontaneous expression of human feeling. It remains a rich gift, a splendid alms, flung to the poor humble beggars, whom no one, however, cares to shelter, because a homeless wandering beggar wins confidence and sympathy from no one. The Jew is not permitted to forget that the daily bread of civil rights must be given to him." Unquote. Then he chastises the Europeans for robbing the Jews of their dignity, and then judging the Jews for their deficiencies caused by European oppression. But he notes that now that Jews are starting to think about nationalism, there's hope for real equality to be realized. Quote, "Grant us but the happiness of independence. Allow us to be the sole masters of our fate. Give us a bit of land. Grant us only what you granted the Serbians and Romanians, the advantages of a free national existence, and then dare to pass a slighting judgment upon us, to reproach us with a lack of men of genius. At present, we still live under the oppression of the evils you have inflicted upon us. What we lack is not genius, but self-respect, and the consciousness of human dignity of which you have robbed us." Unquote. And when he's talking about Serbia and Romania, they were autonomous areas of the Ottoman Empire in the early 19th century and became independent after the Russian-Turkish War in 1878. Back to the auto-emancipation pamphlet. Quote, "Happily, affairs are now in a somewhat different position. The events of the last few years in enlightened Germany, in Romania, in Hungary, and especially in Russia, have effected what the far bloodier persecutions of the Middle Ages could not effect. The national consciousness, which until then had existed only in the latent state of a sterile martyrdom, burst forth under our eyes among the masses of the Russian and Romanian Jews in the shape of an irresistible movement towards Palestine. Mistaken as this movement has been proved by its results, it testifies nevertheless to the correct instinct of the people, to whom it became clear that they needed a home." Unquote. And when he's talking about the movement being mistaken, he's talking about how they're focused on Palestine, because even though Pinsker is one of the first major Zionist thinkers, and he inspired the first wave of Zionist immigration to Palestine, he thinks Palestine is the wrong place for the renewal of the Jewish nation. Quote, "If we would have a secure home, so that we may give up our endless life of wandering, and rehabilitate our nation in our own eyes and in the eyes of the world, we must above all not dream of restoring ancient Judea. We must not attach ourselves to the place where our political life was once violently interrupted and destroyed. The goal of our present endeavors must not be the Holy Land, but a land of our own. We need nothing but a large piece of land for our poor brothers, a piece of land which shall remain our property, from which no foreign master can expel us." Unquote. And then he discusses practical plans, that there should be an organization or institute made up of bright lights of the Jewish world who will work on how to make this happen. Like I said earlier, the Zionists weren't usually interested in all of the world's Jews moving to the new national land. They thought Zionism would make life better for Jews in the diaspora. Pinsker thinks that it's mostly the Jewish poor who should be shipped off to the new nation, because then there won't be this giant surplus of pathetic people to discriminate against in the diaspora countries. So the poor will go off to a land of new opportunities, and the wealthier Jews that still have professions or businesses can represent the Jews well in the diaspora countries. Quote, "What should we do first of all? How should we make a beginning? We believe that a nucleus for this beginning is already at hand. As representative of our national interest, this institute must be made up of the heads of our people, our greatest and best forces, men of finance, of science, and of affairs, statesmen and publicists, must join hands with one accord in steering towards the common destination. This would succeed chiefly and especially in creating a secure and inviolable home for the surplus of those Jews who live as proletarians in the different countries and are a burden to the native citizens. There can, of course, be no question whatever of a united immigration of the entire people. The comparatively small number of Jews in the Occident, meaning Western Europe, who constitute an insignificant percentage of the Jewish population, and for this reason, perhaps, are better situated and even to an extent naturalized, may in the future remain where they are. The wealthy may also remain, even where the Jews are not readily tolerated. But as we have said before, there is a certain point of saturation, beyond which their numbers may not increase, if the Jews are not to be exposed to the dangers of persecution, as in Russia, Romania, Morocco, and elsewhere. It is this surplus which, a burden to itself and to others, conjures up the evil fate of the entire people. It is now high time to create a refuge for this overplus. We must occupy ourselves with the foundation of such a lasting refuge, not with the purposeless collection of donations for pilgrims or fugitives who forsake in their consternation a hospitable home, to perish in the abyss of a strange and unknown land." Unquote. It's interesting here that he mentions Morocco as a place where Jews are persecuted, because Morocco is often thought of as a place where relations were good between Jews and Arab Muslims. And also because it shows that the Zionists weren't just thinking about European Jews in their political program and their various ideas. Also note that he sees the new state as a refuge, and that seems to be one of the main functions of the state in his mind, a refuge for all the Jews who are being attacked around the world. And he goes on to talk about what should we choose. And up until now, it's mostly been North America or Palestine and Syria that Zionists have been focusing on. So he weighs in on this debate. Quote, "The land which we are about to purchase must be productive and have a good situation, and an area sufficient to allow the settlement of several millions. Its selection is, of course, of the first and highest importance, and must not be left to offhand decision or to certain preconceived sympathies or individuals, as has alas happened lately. This land must be uniform and continuous in extent, for it lies in the very nature of our problem that we must possess as a counterpoise to our dispersion one single refuge, since a number of refuges would again present the features of our old dispersion. This tract might form a small territory in North America, or a sovereign pashalik in Asiatic Turkey, recognized by the Porte and the other powers as neutral. It would certainly be an important duty of the Directory to secure the assent of the Porte, and probably of the other European cabinets to this plan." Unquote. And a pashalik is basically a province in the Ottoman Empire. So where earlier he's talking about independence, like Serbia or Romania, when it comes to Palestine, or whatever territory he's imagining in the Ottoman Empire, he's not imagining an independent state, but some kind of province of the Ottoman Empire. And when he talks about the assent of the Porte, he means the consent of the Ottoman government. The Porte is the Ottoman government, the sublime door. And note that he mentions that this province might need the consent of the other European governments, and also that they should recognize it as neutral. What he's talking about here is that at this time, the European governments were constantly meddling in the affairs of the Ottomans, and there had been a series of recent wars with Russia. So the Europeans might worry that a Jewish province might be aligned with one or the other of the great powers. So if you're going to have a Jewish province, it needed to be neutral, and it would likely need the consent of the Europeans. And note that Pinsker sees the Ottoman government as one of the European governments, not as an exotic Oriental power. The Ottoman Empire is based in Turkey, which is located to the west of Russia and Ukraine, for example, and has been in negotiations to be part of the EU for the past 20 years. And at this time, it had territories in the Balkans, and just 4 years before this pamphlet was written, they still controlled Romania and Bulgaria. The Ottoman Empire was often referred to as the sick man of Europe at this time, because it was having a number of economic and political difficulties, some of which we'll discuss next time. But it was the sick man of Europe, not the sick man of the Orient or the Middle East. Also, when Pinsker talks about a territory in North America, he doesn't mean an independent state there either. A territory was the name of a particular form of polity in the United States. In this time period, most of the western and central states of the United States were not yet states, but territories. They had their own governments, but they didn't have voting rights in the U.S. Congress, and they were more directly ruled by the federal government of the U.S. than the actual states were. So the degree of sovereignty of the Jewish state was actually quite limited in Pinsker's imagination. And Pinsker himself favored a state in the U.S. because it was a prosperous growing country with lots of uninhabited space, and because the vast majority of East European Jews were in fact going to the U.S. anyways. So he probably felt that economic prosperity and empty land and popularity was more important than full sovereignty. And he asserts that the place that the Zionists choose should be a land of opportunity. If you're going to pick Palestine or Syria, you need to convince him that there's potential for the Jews to be able to develop that land. And if they do choose the U.S., which to him is the obvious choice because of its growing prosperity and uninhabited spaces, as opposed to Ottoman Palestine, which is full of peasant villages, well then they need to hurry up and they need to get moving because it's filling up fast. Quote, "If the experts give their opinion in favor of Palestine or Syria, this decision would have to be based on the hypothesis that the country could be transformed in time by labor and industry into a quite productive one. In this case, land there would rise in price in the future. Everyone who has the slightest judgment can see at first glance that the purchase of lands in America would, because of the swift rise of that country, not be a risky undertaking, but a lucrative enterprise." Get your bitcoins now. Of course, the establishment of a Jewish refuge cannot come about without the support of the governments. In order to attain the latter, and to ensure the perpetual existence of a refuge, the creators of our national regeneration will have to proceed with patience and care. What we seek is at bottom neither new nor dangerous for anyone. Instead of the many refuges which we have always been accustomed to seek, we would fain have one single refuge, the existence of which, however, would have to be politically assured." Unquote. And then he ends with this summary of his arguments. Quote, "We may sum up the contents of this pamphlet in the following sentences. The Jews are not a living nation. They are everywhere aliens, therefore they are despised. The civil and political emancipation of the Jews is not sufficient to raise them in the estimation of the peoples. The proper and only remedy would be the creation of a Jewish nationality, of a people living upon its own soil, the auto-emancipation of the Jews. Their emancipation as a nation among nations by the acquisition of a home of their own. We should not persuade ourselves that humanity and enlightenment will ever be radical remedies for the malady of our people. The lack of national respect and self-confidence, of political initiative and of unity are the enemies of our national renaissance. In order that we may not be constrained to wander from one exile to another, we must have an extensive, productive place of refuge, a rendezvous which is our own. A way must be opened for the national regeneration of the Jews by a Congress of Jewish notables. Help yourselves, and God will help you." Unquote. So this is the psychology of early Zionism. The Jews are oppressed because they're not a nation. They're not accepted as natives, but they're not respected as foreigners. They're just alien strangers who will only ever be hated and feared unless they have a country of their own. A refuge state within a larger political body, like the United States or the Ottoman Empire, which will fix the class structure of the diaspora countries by absorbing all the excess poor people and rag sellers and hustlers, by giving a place for people to escape to, and by making the Jewish people a nation worthy of respect, who can command that respect vis-a-vis the other countries of the world. I mentioned earlier that people formed Lovers of Zion clubs, in part inspired by Pinsker, and Pinsker gets elected as the president of the Lovers of Zion Association. But Zionists also formed some other associations. One that often gets mentioned because it sent people to Palestine who started agricultural colonies was the BILU organization, the Young Pioneers. They formed a group of about 525 members that raised money to send pioneers to establish farming colonies in Palestine and Syria. According to Alan Dowdy in his book Arabs and Jews in Palestine, quote, "BILU formed a society, initially of 14, of those willing to go to commit to emigrating at once to Palestine. The movement spread rapidly, reaching among others Chaim Chisin in Moscow. He's the kid that I mentioned a few minutes earlier, who saw himself as a Russian until the pogroms and anti-Semitic legislation hit." Dowdy continues, "Determined to demonstrate their seriousness, an advance guard landed in Jaffa already in June 1882. Though the BILU Society never sent more than a few dozen settlers to Palestine, they became an important symbol of the pioneering ethic later established. Personal sacrifice, working the land, overcoming all obstacles in order to re-establish a Jewish presence in Eretz Israel. In their initial manifesto, issued from Constantinople en route to Palestine, the Biluim, the members of BILU, also spelled out, probably for the first time, a concrete political goal in relation to existing Ottoman rule and demographic realities." Unquote. So let's take a look at the BILU Manifesto, also from 1882, the same year as Pinsker's auto-emancipation. It begins with the same quote from Hillel as in Pinsker's pamphlet. Quote, "If I do not help myself, who will help me?" Unquote. And it continues, "Nearly 2,000 years have passed since, in an evil hour, after a heroic struggle, the glory of our temple vanished in fire, and our kings and chieftains exchanged their crowns and diadems for the chains of exile. We lost our country where our beloved ancestors had lived. Into the exile we took with us, of all our glories, only a spark of the fire by which our temple, the abode of the Great One, was engirdled, and this little spark kept us alive, while the towers of our enemies crumbled into dust, and this spark leapt into the celestial flame, and illuminated the heroes of our race, and inspired them to endure the horrors of the dance of death." Unquote. Now, aside from that being some really bad adolescent writing, an autos da fe was the burning of heretics in the Spanish Inquisition, And they're referencing that because in Spain, during the Inquisitions in the 15th century, huge numbers of Jews and Muslims converted to Christianity for fear of being persecuted. And then they were persecuted anyways, as heretics, because people didn't believe that their conversions were sincere. So there's parallels there to the failures of assimilation in the 19th century. Also note that inside of this bad writing, that there's a lot of biblical imagery. But the BILU people were not particularly religious at all. They're mostly secular and influenced somewhat by Marx. They want to form agricultural cooperatives in their colonies, not religious communities. Yet for secular and religious Jews alike, Bible stories and symbolism were a powerful force. And they continue with their melodramatic literary massacre. Quote, "And this spark is again kindling, and will shine for us a true pillar of fire, going before us on the road to Zion, while behind us is a pillar of cloud, the pillar of oppression threatening to destroy us. Are you asleep, O nation? What have you been doing until 1882? Sleeping and dreaming the false dream of assimilation. Now, thank God, you have awaked from your slothful slumber. The pogroms have awakened you from your charmed sleep. Your eyes are open to recognize the obscure and delusive hopes. Can you listen in silence to the taunts and mocking of your enemies? Where is your ancient pride, your old spirit? Remember that you are a nation possessing a wise religion, a law, a constitution, a celestial temple whose wall is still a silent witness to the glories of the past. Your state in the west is hopeless. The star of your future is gleaming in the east. Deeply conscious of all the foregoing, and inspired by the true teaching of our great master, Hillel, if I do not help myself, who will help me?" And their manifesto lays out their political goals in point form. Quote, "We want, number 1, a home in our country. It was given to us by the mercy of God. It is ours as registered in the archives of history. Number 2, to beg it of the Sultan himself, and if it be impossible to obtain this, to beg that we may at least possess it as a state within a larger state. The internal administration to be ours, to have our civil and political rights, and to act within the Turkish Empire only in foreign affairs, so as to help our brother Ishmael in his time of need." Unquote. So these guys, like the religious Zionists I mentioned earlier, do ideally want a sovereign independent state. And my sense is that among the general public, the preference is for an independent state, but among the big movers and thinkers, who I guess are more educated about the politics of the world, the preference is for a state that belongs to a multinational federation or empire. What really jumps out to me in this passage is the innocence and naivete of this. They think they're just going to beg the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire and that he's going to give them a whole independent country for free. And that if that doesn't work, maybe he'll give them some kind of autonomous region like Romania used to be a few years earlier. And their only duty to the Ottomans will be to help their Muslim brothers in a time of war. And they refer to Ishmael because in the Bible, Ishmael is the ancestor of all the Arabs, and his brother Isaac is the ancestor of all the Jews, and they're both the sons of Abraham. So they're referring to their Arab brothers, or maybe their Muslim brothers in general there. So you can see here that even though Jews are largely literate, and in that sense they're more educated on the whole than other peoples who tend to be majority illiterate peasants, this doesn't mean that they know anything about the world or about politics. And the ignorance here is really staggering. This is the world before the internet, before TV news, before radio, and they have books, but the field of anthropology is just beginning at this time, and it's not very good yet. And we'll see how this ignorance impacts things tremendously later on. And actually, in 1878, after the Turkish-Russian War that I mentioned a few times now, there was a conference in Berlin where the parties involved in the war were negotiating the new borders of the Balkan states. And some Jews actually submitted a memorandum requesting that the Ottoman Empire make an autonomous Jewish monarchy in Palestine, just like Bulgaria was about to become an autonomous state within the empire. And I couldn't find out who had submitted that memorandum, but I assume that it's some of the religious Zionists that I mentioned, because they were the only ones thinking along those terms before 1881. Unsurprisingly, the Ottomans were not thrilled about the idea of more and more territories gaining autonomy and breaking away from them. Anyhow, in 1884, there's another Zionist conference, but this time it's in Katowice, Poland. And unlike the first conference that was just from inside Romania, this conference has representatives from all around Europe, though mostly the Russian Empire. And at this conference, the Lovers of Zion clubs become an official organization under the leadership of Leon Pinsker, author of Auto-Emancipation. Now, even though Pinsker, one of the big leaders of the movement at this point, was generally against Palestine as the location for the Jewish nation, very few of the Zionists in general were interested in anything but Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. After all, if they wanted to go to America or Argentina, they could just go live in America, which is what the great majority of Jews in the Russian Empire were already doing when they were escaping the pogroms and the oppression of Russia. Nationalism is inherently a tool of the imagination, trying to unite people that have never met and that never will meet, and trying to get these people to identify with expanses of territory that they'll never visit. And especially in this case, where you're trying to cobble together a nation out of people who are living in a diaspora all across the world, speaking different languages, having different traditions and cultures, even different skin colors and racial features. And the major thing that actually does unite Jews from all across the world is that they share the same imagination. The imagination of the world that's found in the Jewish religion and in the Torah, and all of the stories in the Torah, from Abraham and Sarah down to the kingdom of David and Solomon. So many of these stories revolve around the land of Israel, either getting there, and then all of the events that happen there, and all the commandments that you're supposed to perform there, and all the rituals that take place in the specific temple that's in Jerusalem. And then after the great exiles in the Babylonian and Roman periods, much of the religion and lore of Judaism is about how life outside of the land of Israel is in exile, and that the real Jewish life will resume with the eventual return to Zion, which is the name of the hill that ancient Jerusalem was built around. And all of the practices of the Jews in exile are just substitutes for being in the land of Israel and at the temple. So for the past 2,000 years, every single synagogue on the planet has the congregation all facing Jerusalem. For centuries and centuries, religious Jews have been saying prayers to return to Zion 3 times a day. And at the end of every Passover Seder, everyone says next year in Jerusalem, reasserting the idea that that's where the real Jewish life is. And while Jewish cultures around the world coped with exile by making the return to Zion a sort of dream that would only come true in end times, it's kind of central to the religion and the world of ideas that surrounds it. Yasha Levine, who's a left-wing anti-Zionist Jew who grew up in the Soviet Union without much religion, was recently reading the Torah for research on a novel that he's working on, and he put out a series of Substacks last year where he argues that as much as left-wing Jews might not like it, Zionism is in fact at the core of the Jewish religion. Quote, Zionism is the belief that the Jews constitute one people and that they are bound to the Holy Land by forces beyond human control. Nationalism might be a relatively new idea, and Zionism itself dates back to the 19th century, but this basic concept of a unique Jewish people united by destiny and tied to a land is much older than that and is based on the core text of Judaism, the Torah. This idea, which I call ancient Zionist, is a spiritual one, and it's central to Judaism. It's the sun around which everything else revolves. Even the ultra-religious sects known for their anti-Zionism, including the Satmar or even Naturei Karta, whose members show up to support Palestine at protests and who burn their Israeli passports, they support ancient Zionism. In this religion, the Jewish people are tied to a specific territory given to them by their God. They are commanded to dwell in this land, to control it. According to the text, it's their destiny, their holy calling, their duty. The Torah was essentially written and edited to be kind of a proto-nationalist text that reaffirmed Jewish Israelite ownership over the Holy Land. It was probably put together while the priestly class was in forced Babylonian exile in 597 BCE. So even if we forget this God character, the political purpose of this religious text was at its core nationalistic. It tied a people to a land. This ancient Zionist doctrine was more or less natural because for the most part, this Israelite ethno-religious community lived on the land. Then, around 70 CE, the Roman Empire put down a revolt in Judea and destroyed the Second Temple in Jerusalem and banned Jews from praying at their holiest site, the site where all main religious sacrifices were carried out. Jews lost total control of the land that God had promised them, and Judaism became a religion in exile. And so the old Judaism of the Torah morphed into the Judaism of the rabbis. To keep the religion alive and to keep their own power over their communities, rabbis adapted the religion so that it could exist without attachment to the land, without the temple, and without animal sacrifices that had to be carried with exacting precision. Instead of sacrificing animals, Jews would pray and pray and pray and follow very strict rules and study the Torah and Talmud, a new text that now superseded the Torah. In essence, these new Jews would sacrifice themselves, their time, their effort, instead of sacrificing goats and pigeons and bulls. The religion morphed, but the focus on the land and the pact that God made with the Jewish people remained, but it became more abstract. It was turned into a messianic promise. The Jews would be restored to Israel and Jerusalem when they finally redeemed themselves in the eyes of God. This went on up until the 19th century, when the liberalization in Europe allowed Jews to more easily leave their oppressive communities. Almost 2,000 years had passed at this point, and all this time the ancient Zionism that was built into Judaism had remained part of the religion, but only in a purely spiritual sense. The Holy Land and God's promise was the focus of daily prayers, but no one ever thought that the Jews could actually return and rule the land. What were the Jews going to do? Storm Jerusalem by force in their fur hats and funny socks? It wasn't even a possibility." Unquote. But suddenly, the Ottoman Empire opened its doors, and it was a possibility. So it was to be expected that the masses of Jews in Europe coalesced around the land of Israel as the spot for the national Jewish revival and for the Jewish state, and not the United States or Argentina or any of the other places that Zionists started looking into in the early 20th century that we'll talk about in a future episode. Another thing to consider about the choice of Palestine over North America or Argentina is that Palestine isn't that far from Eastern Europe. Odessa is closer to Jerusalem than it is to Paris, for example, and it's way closer than New York. And like I pointed out earlier, the Ottoman Empire was part of Europe. It wasn't just some far-off land. And we'll see next time that the Ottoman system of letting different religions govern themselves, more or less, was a huge draw for the Zionists. And people totally forget this because of the discourse around colonialism, but many Jews saw themselves as culturally more close to the Arabs and to the Orient than to Europe and the West. I mean, these people didn't know the first thing about Arabs or Muslims or anything, and they thought the Sultan might just give them Palestine if they asked nicely. But even in more recent times, in the Soviet Union, I remember my friend's mother telling me that where she was from, in Uzbekistan, and later in Moscow, the Jews and Muslims got along better than Jews and Christians did, or Muslims and Christians did, because the Jewish and Muslim cultures and traditions were more similar and familiar. And they were both minorities living under a majority, so they had more of a critical view of the ruling state and of the pork-eating dominant culture. So all in all, about 30,000 Jews or so immigrate from Palestine to Europe from 1882 to 1903. And most of these people were refugees and economic immigrants. They weren't going there for ideological Zionist reasons, but just to get away from the hell of the Russian Empire and of its pogroms, and to find new opportunities. The vast majority of these immigrants went to Jerusalem. Only 10% of them were Zionists inspired by Pinsker and the ideas of Jewish nationalism, and most of those went to live on the various agricultural colonies that we'll look at in episode 3. And thus began the first wave, or aliyah in Zionist terminology, meaning ascent, of European Zionists to Palestine in the Ottoman Empire. And while some of them were just refugees, or people looking for a new life, many went there hoping to eventually create a Jewish state in the Ottoman Empire, and to reclaim, or in their words, redeem, the land of Israel, and turn it into a national homeland for the Jews, 1900 years after the last great exile from Judea. Now, from the vantage point of today, we know that when it comes to the future of Zionism in this period, relations between Arabs and Jews are going to be everything. But what did these early Zionists think about the people who had been living in the land of Israel for the past several hundred years? And some of them dating back to the times of the ancient Hebrews and Canaanites, thousands of years ago. So what did they think about these people? The answer is, they didn't. According to Doughty, quote, "Jews had lived as a minority among other peoples and had relied on separation and solidarity for self-preservation and protection. Within Jewish communities, where Jewish politics operated, there was little need to deal with non-Jews, who fell under the jurisdiction of the non-Jewish national government. There was no experience in dealing with non-Jewish groups who might fall under Jewish jurisdiction. This was outside Jewish history and tradition, at least since ancient times. Thus, it is not too surprising that the new immigrants to Palestine, entering a land where they expected to build their own community, simply did not think too much about what was already there." Unquote. Again, remember that this is pre-radio, pre-internet. These people don't know much about anything outside of their own experience or from newspapers, and they have no one to compare themselves to. And Doughty continues, quote, "Though this obliviousness would dissipate after they encountered reality, the indigenous society was basically irrelevant and did not play a role in their visions of the future. This remarkable omission can be illustrated on many fronts. Modern Hebrew fiction begins with Abraham Mapu's Ahavat Zion, Love of Zion, in 1853, and up to the early 1890s, much of the Hebrew fiction dealt with Eretz Israel, both ancient and modern. The leading scholar of this literature has written, quote, "I cannot pretend to have read all Hebrew fiction published during these 40 years, but I have read a goodly portion of it, and I have come across only 2 examples suggesting that Eretz Israel might be occupied by any other people. Only 2, unquote. And now we're quoting back to Dowdy. Among would-be emigrants, during the debate between America or Palestine as the preferred destination, ignorance about actual conditions in Palestine was sometimes an advantage for its partisans. When Chaim Hisson was struggling to find rationalizations for going to Palestine rather than to America as originally decided, he was provided by a fellow student with a superb argument. Quote, he confronted me with the fact that in Eretz Israel there are no agricultural competitors, compared with the significance of their presence in America, unquote, where, according to this poorly informed informant, Americans knew how to keep new immigrants down. While Hisson must have learned before his arrival in Palestine that there were indeed agricultural competitors there, this particular myth was apparently widely believed in certain circles at the time. To the extent that Palestinophiles had clear impressions about Ottoman Palestine, they saw it as part of a backward civilization that would profit from the skills and resources that they, the new immigrants, would bring from the more advanced European world. This would become, in fact, the basic mantra that Jewish settlers in Palestine would adopt in years to come. Though it was the hostility of Europe that forced them out, they still believed in European civilizations. Europeans themselves, they probably would have grumbled, should give it a try. Unquote. So, this is a very insular society, where most people don't have much contact with outsiders, even within Europe. And they have a really limited understanding and awareness of the people living in the sort of mythical land of Eretz Israel that they've been dreaming of in their heads since childhood. And while there's more and more news coming to Europe from Jews that have immigrated to Palestine about what life was like there, everyone writing home is living in urban areas and has experience mostly with urban Arab culture. When it comes to the rural population, all they know is various ideas that they imagined from Bible stories, plus ideas that they had about peasants living in Europe. So now the stage is set to look at what happens when the first Zionists arrive in Palestine in the 1880s and 1890s, and how it fits or doesn't fit into the 2 competing narratives about the Israel-Palestine conflict. But before we do that, we first need to look at the society and culture and people of 19th century Palestine in the Ottoman Empire, who are living their lives and minding their business when the Zionists show up hoping to turn their land into a Jewish state one day. And that's what we're going to do next time. But first, if you found this interesting and valuable so far, then consider giving me some goddamn money. I've worked on this series basically full-time since April 2024, and I mostly get paid per episode, which means that I was making very little money this entire time, surviving from part-time work and some monthly donations, and some one-time donations from viewers like you. And this time I even had to go into a bit of debt to make it through to the end. And I'm pretty burnt out at the moment. And I have the first 4 episodes all done basically, and they'll be out very soon. But the last 2, which are the big shocker ones, the big reveals, well, I have all the research and notes, but I still need to mash them into scripts, and I won't be able to do that without your help. So if you have extra cash lying around, hand it over. Don't think about it. Just hand it over. There are links in the show description for per episode, monthly, and one-time donations, whatever you prefer. And I don't offer any extra perks or videos or anything to people who donate, just my gratitude, because again, the idea behind the show is public education, not to sell a product or crank out the content. And I want everyone to have access to it. So your donations are solidarity payments, which help keep me alive and which allow me to keep making these. And this is one of those projects where if I had known how much work it would take to do it, I never would have started it. So I'm glad I didn't realize it when I started, or else I never would have done this, and I think that this is important work. Also, note that I don't monetize my channel because I find it extremely annoying and unacceptable to have everything we do now constantly interrupted by idiotic ads. And I don't think it's appropriate for a channel like this one to have ads in the first place. And I certainly don't want to be constantly worried about getting demonetized because of all the idiotic YouTube censorship algorithms. And also because if I monetize this channel, I would legally be considered to be a business, and then I would have to start charging my law clients sales taxes, and I'd have to also start charging all of my donors sales taxes. And I work part-time as a lawyer for tenants, and they're people who don't have a lot of money, and I don't want to charge them any more than I already do, and I can't afford to eat the taxes because I don't charge or make very much to begin with, which is why I'm not already obliged to charge sales taxes. I make so little money. And I became a lawyer specifically so that I could work part-time and be able to do interesting projects like this. Being a lawyer for tenants is rewarding work, and it has better hours than working at a bar, though I have less and less time for it as this podcast has swallowed up my entire life. So I'm relying more and more on donations from you guys. Anyhow, I hope you get a lot out of this series, and until next time, see ya!